Jack Mercer's hand closed around the church door before his mind caught up to his body. His knuckles turned white against old wood. Inside, Nathan Vance was sliding a ring toward Emily Carter's trembling fingers, and Jack, who hadn't spoken a full sentence to another living soul in 2 years, heard himself say low and rough, "Don't." One word. 2 years of silence broken by one word. If you believe love is worth fighting for, even when your voice has forgotten, how subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. The third pew from the front left side nearest the window, that was where Jack Mercer sat every Sunday. And every Sunday, the whole congregation of Cedar Falls pretended not to watch him do it. He came in exactly 4 minutes before the first hymn hat in his hands boots scraped clean, and he left before the final prayer was finished, slipping out the side door like a man escaping a burning building. 2 years he'd done this. 2 years since they buried Sarah Mercer under the cottonwood tree behind his cabin, and 2 years since Jack Mercer had said more than a dozen words to anybody in this town. Emily Carter noticed him the way she noticed everything, quietly and completely. She sat at the organ 4 rows up and to the right, where she could see the whole church without turning her head. She'd been playing that organ since she was 19 years old, and in 7 years, she had learned the rhythms of every family in Cedar Falls, who fought before service and made peace during the second hymn, who slept through the sermon, who came only for the gossip after. But Jack Mercer wasn't a rhythm. He was a silence. And silences, Emily had learned, said more than any hymn ever could. "You're staring again," said Ruth Callahan, leaning close as the congregation rose for the opening hymn. Ruth had been Emily's closest friend since they were girls, and she had the particular gift of noticing things Emily wished to keep private. "I am not staring," Emily said. "I am observing my congregation. Your congregation doesn't include Jack Mercer's hat brim, Emily Carter, and that's exactly what you were looking at." Emily's fingers found the opening chord without needing to look at the keys. A man's hat brim is a perfectly acceptable thing to observe in church, Ruth. Ruth said in a tone that meant she believed nothing of the sort. 3 years now. You watching him watching his boots. I could set my clock by the two of you not speaking to each other. There's nothing to speak about. There's a whole lot to speak about. That man buried his wife and half of himself with her. Somebody ought to remind him the other half is still breathing. Emily didn't answer. Her hands moved through the hymn, and her eyes, despite every intention, otherwise moved to the third pew, where Jack Mercer stood with his hat pressed to his chest, his jaw set like a man enduring rather than worshiping. He did not sing. He never sang. He stood and he endured, and when the hymn ended, he sat back down and stared at a spot on the floorboards until it was time to stand again. Emily had memorized the shape of his shoulders. She was ashamed of how well she'd memorized them. After service, the churchyard filled with the particular noise of a small town, catching up on a week's worth of talk, children weaving between skirts, men discussing cattle prices in low voices, women exchanging news with the efficiency of people who had perfected the art of gossip, disguised as concern. Jack Mercer moved through all of it like a ghost who hadn't been told the funeral was over. "Mr. Mercer?" The voice belonged to Nathan Vance, and it carried the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. Nathan was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed a shade too fine for a Sunday in Cedar Falls. His boots didn't have a speck of trail dust on them, which told its own story to anyone who cared to notice. Jack stopped walking. He didn't turn. "Vance. Fine service, wasn't it? Miss Carter plays beautifully." Nathan's gaze drifted unhurried toward the church steps where Emily stood speaking with 2 of her students. "I've been thinking of asking her to the social next Saturday. Thought I'd mention it seeing as you 2 are acquainted." "We ain't," Jack said. "No." Nathan's smile didn't waver. "Funny, whole town seems to think otherwise. Whole town's wrong." Jack settled his hat back on his head. "You want to court Miss Carter? That's your business, Vance, not mine." "Glad we understand each other." Nathan clapped a hand against Jack's shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly, and felt to anyone watching closely like something else entirely. "Man ought to know where he stands." Jack said nothing. He walked past Nathan Vance without another word, and he did not look toward the church steps. And he did not see Emily Carter watching him go, with an expression she would have denied to her dying breath. Emily's schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a single room with 23 desks and a wood stove that smoked when the wind blew wrong, which in a mountain town meant it smoked more days than not. She taught reading arithmetic and the kind of quiet discipline that came from raising children who weren't her own since her mother's passing 5 years back. Monday morning, she found Nathan Vance leaning against the schoolhouse fence when the children filed out for the noon recess. "Mr. Vance," she kept her voice even professional, "this is unexpected. Thought I'd walk you home, if you'll allow it." He straightened, removed his hat with a flourish that struck Emily as rehearsed. "I meant what I said about the social Miss Carter. I'd be honored if you'd accompany me." Emily considered her answer carefully. Nathan Vance was by every measure the town used an excellent match. His father owned half the good grazing land between Cedar Falls and the territorial line, and Nathan himself had never given her cause for complaint. He was polite. He was steady. He was in every visible way exactly what a sensible woman should want. And yet something in his smile never reached his eyes, and something in the way he said, "I'd be honored," sounded more like a man closing a business deal than a man courting a woman he admired. "I'll consider it," she said. "That's all I ask." He replaced his hat. For now. He left, and Emily stood watching him go, and told herself the unease sitting in her chest was nothing more than nerves. She told herself the same thing every time she thought of Jack Mercer, too, and she believed that lie just as little. The snow came early that year, a hard, sudden storm that rolled down off the mountains on a Wednesday in late June. The kind of freak summer weather that old-timers in Cedar Falls called a widowmaker, because it caught folks unprepared. It buried the road between town and the outlying ranches under 2 feet of white in a single night, and by Sunday morning, half the congregation couldn't make it to service at all. Those who could make it, the families living close to town, the ones with horses hardy enough to break trail, found themselves packed into the church not for worship, but for shelter, because the schoolhouse roof had partially collapsed under the weight, and Pastor Whitfield had opened the church doors to anyone who needed a warm place to sit. Jack Mercer arrived at dawn hauling firewood for the church stove, because Pastor Whitfield's hip had been troubling him, and somebody needed to keep the building from freezing solid. He didn't say much. He never did. He simply worked stacking wood, checking the flue, hauling water, until his hands were raw and his breath came in white clouds. Emily arrived an hour later, escorting 6 of her students whose families couldn't be reached, and found the church transformed into something between a shelter and a strange forced gathering of neighbors who didn't usually spend this much time in one room together. "Miss Carter." Pastor Whitfield met her at the door, his face lined with worry. "Thank God. I need someone to help organize the children, keep them fed and calm. Half the town's stranded here till the road's clear." "Of course." Emily set down her satchel. "How long do you think?" 2 days, maybe 3 if the thaw holds." He glanced past her toward the stove where Jack was crouched feeding another log into the flames. "Mercer's been a godsend. Wouldn't have kept this place warm without him." Emily's gaze followed the pastor's, and for a long moment she simply watched Jack Mercer work the economy of his movements, the way he never wasted a motion, the way his jaw stayed tight, even when there was no one nearby to perform silence for. She had watched this man from 4 rows away for 3 years. She had never once been close enough to hear him breathe. That was about to change. By evening, the church had become something almost domestic women, organizing what food supplies had been brought. Children bedding down on pews, pushed together. Men taking turns keeping the stove fed through the night. Emily found herself near midnight seated on the floor near the stove with a bowl of thin stew, and the only other person still awake nearby was Jack Mercer, sitting 3 feet away with his back against the wall, staring into the fire like it owed him an answer. "You should eat something," Emily said. It was the first sentence she had spoken directly to him in 3 years. Jack's eyes came up slow, like a man surfacing from underwater. "Ma'am?" "The stew. It's not much, but it's warm." She held out a second bowl. "You've been feeding that stove since dawn. You'll fall over if you don't eat." For a long moment, he only looked at her. Really looked the way he hadn't allowed himself to in 3 years of careful avoidance, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of her. This close. No organ between them, no 4 rows of pews, just firelight, and her steady gray eyes waiting for his answer. "Obliged," he said finally, and took the bowl. They ate in silence for a while. It should have been an uncomfortable silence, Emily thought. Instead, it felt like something she'd been circling for a long time without knowing its name. "You don't talk much," she said eventually. "No, ma'am." "Is that because you don't have anything to say, or because you've decided not to say it?" Jack's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, Emily Carter watched Jack Mercer consider a question instead of retreating from it. "Used to talk plenty," he said finally. "Sarah, my wife, she used to say I talked her ear clean off some nights. Couldn't get me to stop." "What happened?" "She died." He said it flat. No drama in it, the way a man says something he said to himself 10,000 times until the words wore smooth as river stones. "Fever took her in 11 days. I talked to her the whole time. Told her everything I could think to tell her every fool thing, every plan we'd made every year we hadn't got to yet." His jaw worked. "Didn't do a damn bit of good. Pardon my language." Emily didn't flinch. "What happened after there wasn't nobody left to talk to?" He looked back at the fire. "Figured I'd said everything worth saying already. Didn't see the use in starting up again for folks who just wanted to hear about my grief so they could feel sorry for me at supper." "I don't want to hear about your grief," Emily said quietly. "I want to hear about you." Jack looked at her again, and this time he didn't look away. "Why?" he said. "Not a question exactly, more like a challenge. Because I've watched you sit in that third pew for 3 years. Mr. Mercer and I have never once heard you laugh, and I find that I would like to know what would cause it." Something shifted in Jack's face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the memory of a man who used to smile easily before grief hollowed him out. "Careful, Miss Carter. Man goes 2 years without laughing might forget how." "Then we'll have to find out together," Emily said, "whether it's a thing a person forgets." They didn't speak again that night. Not really. Just sat near the stove in a silence that had changed its character entirely, from the silence of 2 strangers avoiding each other, to the silence of 2 people who had without quite meaning to stopped avoiding. 10. The storm held the town captive for 3 days, and in those 3 days, something in Cedar Falls shifted in ways no one could have predicted. Jack Mercer, who for 2 years had been a shadow at the edge of every gathering, found himself on the second day teaching Emily's 6 stranded students how to whittle small animals from kindling wood. His big rough hands surprisingly gentle as he guided a boy's fingers around a pocket knife. "You're good with them," Emily said, watching from the doorway. "Sarah wanted children," Jack said, not looking up from the wooden horse taking shape under his knife. "We never got the chance." He handed the horse to the boy who grinned like he'd been given gold. "Figure this is close enough." "It's not the same," Emily said gently. "No," Jack agreed. "But it ain't nothing either." On the 3rd day, as the thaw began, and word came that the roads would be passable by morning, Emily found Jack alone near the church's side door, checking the woodpile one last time before the town would scatter back to their separate lives. "You'll go back to the 3rd pew Sunday," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Jack straightened, met her eyes. "Reckon I will." "And you'll leave before the final prayer, same as always." "Reckon that too." He studied her for a long moment. "You got a point. You're working toward Miss Carter. Or you just cataloging my habits?" Emily stepped closer, closer than the 3 days of forced proximity had yet allowed. Close enough that Jack had to look down to meet her eyes, close enough that he caught the faint scent of wood smoke and lavender soap that clung to her hair. "I've watched you sit alone for 3 years," she said. "I don't intend to watch you do it for 3 more." Jack's breath caught just slightly, just enough that Emily noticed. "Ma'am, I ain't much of a prospect. Man who can't hardly string 10 words together on a good day." "You strung together considerably more than 10 words to me 2 nights ago," Emily said. "I counted." That ghost of a smile returned more solid this time. "You counted." "I told you, I'm an observant woman." For a moment, just a moment, Jack Mercer looked like he might reach for her hand. His fingers twitched at his side rose an inch, and then some old grief-worn instinct pulled them back, and the moment passed, and he settled his hat lower over his eyes instead. "Roads'll be clear by morning," he said. "Best get you and the children home safe." Emily watched him retreat into old habits like a man pulling a blanket back over a wound, and she did not chase him. But she noted with the same careful attention she gave everything that he had not said no. The town returned to its rhythms once the roads cleared, but the rhythms had changed subtly in ways only Ruth Callahan seemed to notice. "You're different," Ruth said the following Sunday, watching Emily's fingers move through the opening hymn. "Something happened in that church during the storm." "Several things happened during the storm, Ruth. The roof of my schoolhouse partially collapsed for one." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Ruth's eyes cut toward the third pew, where Jack Mercer sat in his customary place, except this Sunday, for the first time in 3 years, his eyes weren't fixed on the floorboards. They kept drifting helpless and unhidden toward the organ. Emily felt the weight of that gaze like sunlight on her back, warm and impossible to ignore. "Nothing happened," she said, which was technically true. Nothing had happened. Words had happened. A bowl of stew had happened. A silence transformed had happened. But nothing in the way Ruth meant it had happened at all, not yet. Nathan Vance noticed the change too, and he noticed it with considerably less patience than Ruth Callahan. He found Emily after service, his smile carrying a new edge beneath its practiced ease. "Miss Carter, I don't believe you've given me an answer about the social." "I haven't had the chance to consider it properly, Mr. Vance. The storm's past," Nathan said, and something in his voice made Emily go still. "I understand you spent a good deal of it in Jack Mercer's company. I spent it seeing to my students' welfare, along with half the town." "Of course." Nathan's smile widened, but it no longer reached anywhere near his eyes. "I only mention it because I'd hate for you to waste your consideration on a man who's already proven he doesn't know how to hold on to what he loves. Buried one wife already, didn't he?" The cruelty of it landed like a slap, quiet and precise. Emily felt her spine straighten. "That is an unkind thing to say about a grieving man, Mr. Vance." "It's an honest thing." Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that pretended at gentleness. "Emily, I don't say this to wound you. I say it because I think highly of you, and I'd rather you understand your position clearly. My father holds the note on half the land your school sits on. Did you know that?" Emily's stomach turned cold. "I did not." "The town council's been slow settling accounts since the winter before last. My father's been patient. But patience has its limits, and a man in my father's position doesn't extend kindness forever without some expectation of return." Nathan's eyes held hers steady and terrible in their calm. "I'd hate for that patience to run short over something as small as a school teacher's poor judgment in choosing her company." "Are you threatening my school, Mr. Vance?" "I'm informing you of a fact," Nathan said pleasantly. "Facts aren't threats, Miss Carter. They're simply true whether we like them or not." He tipped his hat. "Think on the social. I'd very much like an answer by week's end." He walked away, and Emily stood rooted to the churchyard grass, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with 23 children who depended on that schoolhouse remaining open. She didn't tell Jack. Not that Sunday, not the next. What would she say that Nathan Vance had all but told her that her school's survival depended on which man she smiled at? It sounded absurd even in her own head, the kind of melodrama that belonged in a dime novel, not in the quiet reality of Cedar Falls. But the fear sat in her chest anyway, cold and persistent, and it colored every interaction that followed. Jack noticed. Of course, the man had spent 2 years learning to read silences, and Emily's had gone from warm to guarded in the space of a week. He found her on a Tuesday afternoon at the schoolhouse, repairing the roof damage from the storm, with lumber he'd hauled down from his own land without being asked. "You don't owe me this," Emily said, watching him hammer a new beam into place. "Ain't about owing." Jack didn't look down from the roof. "Roof's broke. I got lumber and 2 hands. Simple as that." "Simple," Emily repeated, and something in her voice made Jack pause his work and look down at her properly. "Something's troubling you," he said. "Not a question. It's nothing, Miss Carter." His voice carried a gentleness that surprised her, coming from a man whose default setting was silence and stone. "I spent 2 years watching everybody in this town pretend nothing was troubling them while they fell apart quiet on the inside. I know what that looks like. On you, same as anybody." Emily looked up at him, at the careful concern in his weathered face, and felt something in her resolve crack. "Nathan Vance's father holds the note on this land," she said. "Nathan strongly implied, that my school's future depends on my accepting his courtship." Jack's hammer went still in his hand. His whole body went still. In fact, in a way that made Emily's breath catch, not fear of him, never fear of him, but a recognition that she had just watched something shift behind his eyes, something old and protective, waking up after 2 years of dormancy. "He said that to you," Jack said. His voice had dropped, gone low and dangerous in a way she'd never heard from him. Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear enough. Jack climbed down from the roof, slow and deliberate, and stood before her with his jaw set hard. "That ain't courtship, Miss Carter. That's a man using a debt to buy himself a wife. I'm aware. You don't have to accept it." He said it fierce, urgent, more words strung together at once than she'd heard from him in the whole 3 years prior combined. "Whatever he's threatening, there's ways around it. Territorial Land Office keeps records. If the note's legitimate, the school board can petition for terms extensions. Ain't no law says a school teacher owes a man her hand because his father holds paper on the land." Emily stared at him, startled by the sudden fire in him. "You know about land law?" "I know about surviving on land that other men wanted taken from me," Jack said, and something haunted crossed his face before he pushed past it. "Point is, you got options that don't involve marrying a man who'd threatened 23 children to get what he wants, and I intend to help you find every one of them." "Why?" Emily asked, echoing his own question from the storm 3 feet from the church stove a lifetime ago. Jack's answer came slower this time, weighted with something he'd clearly been fighting since the moment she handed him that bowl of stew. "Because I spent 2 years thinking I didn't have nothing left worth speaking up for," he said. "And I'm done being wrong about that." The words hung between them heavier than anything the storm had brought down on Cedar Falls, and Emily felt the cold fear in her chest give way just slightly to something warmer and considerably more dangerous. "Jack," she said his given name for the first time, and she watched it land on him like a physical thing. "Emily," he answered, just as careful, just as deliberate. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. The distance between the third pew and the organ had been closing for 3 years, and now, standing in the wreckage of a storm-broken schoolhouse roof, it had very nearly disappeared entirely. It was Ruth Callahan's voice calling Emily's name from down the road that finally broke the moment, and Jack stepped back, and Emily straightened her skirts, and the world resumed its ordinary shape. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and both of them knew it. Nathan Vance did not take kindly to being ignored. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Falls, and by the following Sunday, half the congregation had heard some version of the story. Jack Mercer rebuilding the schoolhouse roof. Jack Mercer and Emily Carter caught in conversation that ran long past what propriety strictly required Jack Mercer, of all men, finding his voice again, after 2 years of silence, and finding it apparently for her. Nathan cornered Jack outside the livery on Tuesday, his easy smile gone, entirely replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Heard you've been busy," Nathan said. "Playing carpenter for Miss Carter's schoolhouse." "Roof needed fixing," Jack said evenly. I had lumber. You had lumber, Nathan repeated with a short, humorless laugh. That's a fine story, Mercer. But we both know what you're building toward isn't a roof. Don't reckon that's your business. It's very much my business. Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to something ugly beneath its polish. My father's held that land note for 3 years. He's been generous with the terms because I asked him to be, because I intended to marry Emily Carter and settle the whole matter cleanly, keep her school running, keep her family's good name intact. That's the kindness I was offering her. His eyes narrowed. You understand what happens if that kindness gets withdrawn. Jack's hands curled slowly into fists at his sides, though his voice stayed level. Sounds to me like you're describing a threat, not a courtship. I'm describing consequences. Nathan's smile returned thin and humorless. A man like you, Mercer widower, half mad with grief, talks to nobody for 2 years. You really think this town would side with you over me if it came to a question of whose intentions toward Miss Carter were more honorable, whose family holds the paper that keeps her school's lights burning? Might be the town sides with whoever ain't threatening children to get a wife, Jack said quietly. Something flickered dangerously across Nathan's face, the mask slipping just for a moment, revealing the entitled cruelty underneath. You're a fool, Mercer. You buried one woman already because you couldn't hold on to what you had. Don't make the same mistake twice by reaching for something that was never going to be yours. Jack went very still. And for a moment, Emily's warning, the cold fear she'd carried since the churchyard, crystallized into something Jack could see clearly for the first time. This wasn't a rivalry over a woman's affections. This was a calculated, deliberate cruelty, wielded by a man who had never once had to fight for anything he wanted, aimed now at the one thing Jack Mercer had let himself want again, after 2 years of believing wanting was a door closed forever. Get off this street, Vance, Jack said very quietly. Before I forget, I'm supposed to be a peaceable man. Nathan laughed an ugly, satisfied sound and walked away without hurrying the way a man walks when he believes he's already won. That night, Jack rode out to the small cemetery behind his cabin where Sarah lay beneath the cottonwood tree, and for the first time in 2 years, he spoke to her without an audience of grief crushing every word before it could form. I don't know what I am doing, Sarah, he said, kneeling in the summer grass. Spent 2 years thinking there wasn't nothing left in me worth giving to anybody. Then this woman hands me a bowl of stew during a storm, and I don't know, something in me that I thought I buried with you started waking back up. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, and Jack let the silence sit for a long moment before continuing. I ain't asking your permission, he said finally. I know that ain't how it works. But I loved you true, and I don't reckon loving somebody else now makes that any less real. I need you to know I ain't forgetting you. I'm just done being a ghost. He stayed until the stars came out fully, and when he finally rose and walked back toward his cabin, something in his shoulders had settled that hadn't settled in 2 long years. Emily, meanwhile, had gone to the territorial land office in the county seat, a full day's ride each way, accompanied by Ruth Callahan, who insisted on coming for propriety's sake, and spent most of the journey extracting every detail of the schoolhouse roof incident, with the persistence of a woman who considered gossip a civic duty. The land clerk, a tired man named Osgood with ink-stained fingers and a habit of squinting at documents like they'd personally wronged him, pulled the relevant deed after nearly an hour of searching. Vance note, he muttered, running a finger down the page. Yes, here. Land parcel 447 school board holding note held by Cornelius Vance originated 3 years back during the drought relief measures. He frowned. Terms look standard enough. Payable over 10 years reasonable interest. Mr. Vance's son implied the note was in some danger of being called, Emily said carefully. That the terms might be accelerated unless certain conditions were met. Osgood's frown deepened. He flipped to another page, then another, his squint intensifying. There's no provision in this note for acceleration outside of default, Miss Carter. School board's payments are current. I can see the record right here. Whatever Mr. Vance implied, this document doesn't support calling the note early. Not without cause, and there ain't no cause here." Relief flooded through Emily so suddenly, her knees nearly buckled. "You're certain?" "Certain as ink on paper, ma'am. Whatever threat was made, it wasn't grounded in this document." Osgood's eyes sharpened with something like professional offense. "If a man's threatening to call a legitimate note without legal cause, that's a matter the territorial commissioner would take considerable interest in. Fraud or something close enough to it." Ruth, who had been listening with growing outrage, put a hand on Emily's arm. "Emily, that snake lied to you." "It would seem so," Emily said. And beneath the relief, something harder and more furious began to build in her chest, not just at the lie itself, but at what it revealed about the man who'd told it, and what he might still be capable of now that his leverage had proven false. She rode back to Cedar Falls with the truth sitting heavy and vindicating in her chest, and she went straight to Jack's cabin before she'd even stopped at her own home to change out of her travel clothes. She found him in the yard splitting firewood with the kind of controlled violence that told her he'd spent the day fighting something other than logs. "Jack." She dismounted quickly. "I went to the land office. The note, it's current, it's legitimate. There's no provision for acceleration. Nathan lied to me. There was never any real threat to the school at all." Jack's axe stilled mid-swing. He set it down slowly, and something in his face, relief, fury, and underneath both a fierce and startled tenderness moved across his features all at once. "He lied," Jack repeated. "Threatened 23 children's schoolhouse over a lie just to force your hand." "It would seem so." "That's fraud," Jack said, his voice low and hard. "That's a man using false pretense to coerce a woman into marriage. Osgood say anything about reporting it?" "He said the territorial commissioner would take considerable interest." Jack's jaw set in a way Emily was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of quiet, dangerous resolve. "Then we report it, properly, get it in front of a circuit judge if it comes to that. Man like Vance needs consequences, not just embarrassment." "Jack." Emily stepped closer, close enough to see the fury banking down into something steadier in his eyes. "Thank you. For believing me. For helping me find this before I made a decision out of fear instead of truth. Wasn't going to let you get bullied into a marriage you didn't want," Jack said simply. "Not while I had breath to do something about it." The space between them had narrowed to almost nothing, and this time neither of them stepped back. Jack's hand rose slow and questioning, and settled against the side of Emily's face with a gentleness that seemed to cost him considerable effort to allow himself. "Emily!" He said her name rough in his throat. "I ain't real good at this. Ain't spoke soft to a woman in 2 years, and even before, I was never much good with pretty words." "I don't need pretty words," Emily said, her breath catching. "I've had 3 years of watching you say more with your silence than most men manage with their whole vocabulary." "That a yes to something?" Jack asked. "Or am I misreading you entirely? Depends what you're asking." Jack's thumb traced feather light along her cheekbone. "Asking if I might call on you proper. Not because some banker's threatening you into it. Because I want to. Because I've been wanting to since a storm trapped us both in a church, and you handed me a bowl of stew like it was the most natural thing in the world." Emily's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, Jack Mercer. You may call on me proper." He didn't kiss her, not yet. Not with 2 years of careful grief still teaching him caution. But he pulled her into an embrace that spoke of everything his silence had never been able to say, and Emily felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely safe. It would not last. Nathan Vance did not accept defeat gracefully, and the lie he'd told was about to become the smallest of his sins. But for one evening in the fading summer light outside Jack Mercer's cabin, 2 people who had spent years learning the shape of loss instead learned together the shape of hope. And neither one of them let go. Nathan Vance heard about the embrace outside Jack Mercer's cabin before the sun had fully set, and by the time he heard it, the story had already grown 3 sizes larger than the truth, which suited his purposes just fine. "Ma'am, I only came because I thought you'd want to know what's being said," said Delphine Ostrander, catching Emily on the schoolhouse steps the next morning, her voice pitched low, with the particular relish of a woman delivering bad news she didn't entirely mind delivering. "Folks are saying you and Jack Mercer were seen carrying on something scandalous out at his place, alone, no chaperone. Folks are saying wrong," Emily said, keeping her voice steady, though her stomach had dropped straight through the floorboards. "Mr. Mercer and I spoke, that's the whole of it. That's not what Nathan Vance is telling anybody who'll listen." Emily's hands went still on the schoolhouse door latch. "Nathan Vance is telling people what happened at Jack's cabin. Telling everybody who'll stand still long enough to hear it," Delphine said. "Says you compromised yourself. Says a decent woman doesn't ride out alone to a widower's property unescorted, whatever the reason. Says—" She hesitated, and for a moment, something like genuine discomfort crossed her face. "Says maybe the school board ought to reconsider who they've got teaching their children if she's got so little regard for her own reputation." The words hit like a fist to the ribs. Emily had known Nathan would retaliate. She hadn't imagined he'd move this fast, or aim this precisely not at her heart, but at her livelihood, at the one thing in Cedar Falls that was entirely hers. "Thank you for telling me, Delphine," Emily said, and her voice came out far calmer than she felt. "I don't believe a word of it myself," Delphine added quickly. "Just thought you ought to know what's coming before it lands on your doorstep." It landed on her doorstep by noon. The school board met in emergency session in the back room of the Mercantile. 5 men seated around a table, stacked with ledgers, and Emily stood before them, with her spine straight and her hands folded, refusing to let them see how badly they shook. "Miss Carter," said Elias Whitcomb, the board chairman, a heavy-set man who had never once in 7 years questioned Emily's conduct, "we've had a complaint lodged. Serious enough we felt obliged to address it directly. I'm aware of the complaint, Mr. Whitcomb. I'm also aware it's a lie." "Nathan Vance says he has witnesses," said another board member, a thin man named Purdy, who owned the feed store and had always struck Emily as the sort who folded whichever way the wind blew hardest. "Nathan Vance has a grudge," Emily said. "I went to Jack Mercer's property because he offered assistance repairing storm damage to this very schoolhouse, the same schoolhouse we're currently sitting 50 feet from. Nothing improper occurred. If Nathan Vance has witnesses, I'd very much like to hear their names, so I can ask them exactly what they claim to have seen." The room went quiet. Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably. "He hasn't named any witnesses specifically." "Because there aren't any," Emily said. "Because nothing happened worth witnessing beyond 2 people having a conversation in a yard in broad daylight." "Be that as it may," Purdy said, "there's the matter of appearances, Miss Carter. This town holds its schoolteacher to a certain standard. This town holds its schoolteacher to a standard that apparently doesn't extend to the man spreading lies about her." Emily snapped and immediately regretted the heat in her voice, though not the words themselves. She took a breath, steadied herself. "Gentlemen, I have taught in this schoolhouse for 7 years without a single complaint against my character. I am not going to stand here and let a man's wounded pride over a rejected courtship dismantle that record with a story that isn't true." Whitcomb studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "Nobody's talking about dismissal, Miss Carter. Not yet. But I'll be honest, Cornelius Vance has considerable influence in this town, and his son's got his ear. If this escalates, it could get uncomfortable for everybody involved, including this board." "Then perhaps," Emily said, "the board should concern itself with the truth of the matter, rather than the comfort of it." She left the meeting with her composure intact, and her hands shaking so badly she had to grip her skirts to hide it. Jack heard about the board meeting from Ruth Callahan, who tracked him down at the livery with the breathless urgency of a woman who considered herself Cedar Falls's unofficial minister of important news. "He's trying to ruin her," Ruth said without preamble. "Nathan Vance. Telling everybody Emily's compromised her reputation, pushing the school board to reconsider her position. All because she wouldn't marry him and instead chose you." Jack's hands stilled on the saddle strap he'd been tightening. "He's threatening her job now. Threatening her whole life in this town, more like." Ruth's face was tight with worry. "You know how fast talk spreads here, Jack. Give it a week, half the congregation will believe whatever version of the story gets repeated loudest, and it won't matter one lick whether it's true." "It's a lie," Jack said, low and dangerous. "Wasn't nothing between us worth this kind of talk. I know that, you know that, but knowing it and stopping it are two different animals." Ruth's eyes searched his face. "Emily needs somebody in her corner right now who isn't afraid of Nathan Vance's family money. You planning on being that somebody, or you planning on going quiet again the second things get difficult?" The question landed like a slap, and Jack felt old instincts rise in him. The 2-year habit of retreat, of silence, of letting the world's cruelty wash past him, because engaging with it cost too much. He'd buried a wife. He'd learned that caring about anything meant risking losing it. Every part of him that had survived the last 2 years by staying small and quiet screamed at him to let this pass, to let Emily fight her own battles to protect himself the only way he knew how. He looked at Ruth, and something harder and more certain settled into his jaw. "I ain't going quiet," he said. "Not on this, not on her." He found Emily at the schoolhouse after the last of her students had been collected by their parents, sitting alone at her desk, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, like she was trying to draw strength up through it. "Heard about the board meeting," Jack said, standing in the doorway. Emily looked up, and the exhaustion in her face hit him harder than any accusation Nathan Vance could have leveled. "It's not just talk anymore, Jack. He's turning the board against me, threatening the one thing in this town that's entirely mine." "I know." Jack crossed the room and knelt beside her desk, bringing himself level with her, instead of towering over her grief. "And I'm sorry. This is my doing as much as his if I hadn't." "Don't." Emily's voice sharpened. "Don't you dare apologize for something that was never yours to be sorry for. Nathan Vance is the one spreading lies. Nathan Vance is the one threatening children's education to punish a woman for not wanting him. You held a hammer and fixed a roof, Jack. That's the whole of your crime." "Still." Jack's jaw worked. "I ain't going to let him do this to you. Whatever it takes." "What does that mean exactly?" "Means I'm going to the territorial commissioner myself," Jack said. "Report the false claim he made about the land note that's fraud plain as day. And Osgood as much as said the commissioner would take interest. Man who'll lie about a debt to coerce a marriage ain't going to think twice about lying to a school board to punish a rejection. Time somebody made him answer for it properly in front of the law, not just in front of gossiping neighbors." Emily's breath caught. "Jack, that's a 2-day ride to the commissioner's circuit court. And if it comes to a formal hearing, Nathan will have his father's lawyers, his father's money, his father's influence with half the territory. And we'll have the truth," Jack said, "and Osgood's records and every ounce of stubborn I got left in me, which, ma'am, having watched me for 3 years, you ought to know is considerable." Despite everything, despite the fear and exhaustion sitting heavy in her chest, Emily felt the corner of her mouth lift. "That's the most words you've strung together in one sitting since the storm." "Getting easier," Jack said. "The more there is worth saying." They rode out together 3 days later, Jack, Emily, and Ruth insisting on accompanying them, for propriety and moral support, though mostly because I want to see Nathan Vance's face when the truth comes out, toward the territorial seat, where Circuit Judge Harmon Cole held court twice monthly. The town predictably noticed their departure, and the whispers followed them clear to the edge of Cedar Falls. "You sure about this?" Emily asked, riding beside Jack as the town shrank behind them. "Once this becomes official, once it's in front of a judge, there's no taking it back. Nathan will fight it with everything his family has." "Let him fight," Jack said. "Man built his whole courtship on a lie and a threat. Ain't much of a foundation to defend. His father's not going to take kindly to a formal fraud complaint against his son. His father ought to have raised a son who didn't need to lie to get a wife," Jack said flatly. "That's on Cornelius Vance far more than it's on us." They made camp that evening in a stand of pines a half-day's ride from the territorial seat, and it was there over a small fire that Ruth, never one to let a silence sit unfilled, asked the question that had clearly been building in her since the storm. "So when's the wedding?" she said entirely too casually, poking at the fire with a stick. Emily nearly choked on her coffee. Ruth. What I'm only asking. Man drives 2 days on horseback to defend your honor in front of a circuit judge. That's not nothing, Emily. That's a man declaring intentions whether he says the words outright or not. Jack, to his credit, didn't flinch, though a flush crept up his neck that had nothing to do with the fire. Ain't thought that far ahead, Miss Callahan. Got a fraud complaint to file first. Ruth said, in the same tone she'd used 3 years' worth of Sundays to comment on Emily's staring. Sure, first things first. Emily shot her friend a warning look, but underneath the embarrassment, something warm and hopeful had settled in her chest, a feeling she hadn't let herself trust in a long while, not since her mother's death had taught her that hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. She held it anyway that night, watching Jack Mercer sit across the fire with his quiet, steady presence, and thought that maybe some things were worth the risk of losing. They reached the territorial seat by midday, a town 3 times the size of Cedar Falls, loud and busy and entirely unfamiliar, and found the circuit courthouse sitting at its center, like a promise of order in a world that had lately felt anything but orderly. Judge Harmon Cole's clerk was a sharp-eyed young man who listened to Jack's account of Nathan Vance's threat with a growing frown, made notes and disappeared into the judge's chambers for nearly an hour before returning. Judge Cole will hear a formal complaint, the clerk said. But I'll tell you plainly, this isn't a small matter you're bringing. Accusing a Vance of fraud is going to draw attention, and Cornelius Vance has friends in territorial politics. You'll want your evidence airtight. We've got the land office records, Emily said. Mr. Osgood confirmed the note had no acceleration provision, that payments were current, that Nathan's claim about the terms was false. That's a start, the clerk said. But you'll want Osgood himself to testify or at minimum provide sworn documentation. Judge Cole doesn't rule on hearsay, especially not against a family with the Vances standing. Jack's jaw tightened. How long to arrange that? Osgood's a day's ride from here in the opposite direction. You're looking at another 4 or 5 days before you could have him here to testify, assuming he's willing to travel. Emily felt the timeline stretch out ahead of her like a widening chasm. 5 more days of Nathan Vance poisoning the school board, 5 more days of gossip, calcifying into accepted truth, 5 more days in which her entire livelihood hung in the balance while she chased documentation 200 miles from home. We don't have 5 days, she said. The school board could vote to remove me before we're even back in Cedar Falls. Then we split up, Jack said suddenly. Ruth rides back to Cedar Falls now, buys us time with the board, tells them formal proceedings are underway, official complaints been filed. They'd be wise to wait for the judge's ruling before acting rash. I'll ride for Osgood myself, get him and his records here as fast as horseflesh allows. Emily. He turned to her, something fierce and protective in his expression. You stay here, file the complaint formally with the judge, make sure the records started proper. That way, no matter what Nathan tries next, there's already a formal proceeding on the books he can't just wish away. That's 3 separate rides in 3 separate directions, Emily said. Jack, that's dangerous. That's the only way we get ahead of him instead of chasing behind, Jack said. Nathan's had a 2-day head start poisoning that town against you. We don't have the luxury of moving slow. Ruth was already checking her horse's girth strap. Her earlier teasing entirely gone, replaced by the same fierce loyalty that had made her Emily's closest friend for 20 years. He's right, Emily. I'll leave within the hour. I can make Cedar Falls by tomorrow evening if I push. And you, Emily said to Jack, fear tightening around her heart at the thought of him riding alone. You'll be careful. Always am, Jack said, and something in his eyes softened as he looked at her. Emily. I didn't fight 2 years of silence just to lose you to a school board vote and a coward's lies. I intend to see this through. He mounted his horse, and for a moment before he turned to ride, he reached down and took her hand. Not a formal gesture, not practiced or rehearsed, just a rough, calloused hand closing around hers with an urgency that said more than any words he might have managed. Wait for me, he said. I will, Emily promised. He rode out within minutes, and Emily watched him go until he vanished into the tree line, and told herself fiercely that the cold feeling settling in her stomach was nothing more than ordinary worry. The formal complaint took the better part of the afternoon to file properly statements affidavits, the tedious machinery of territorial law forward at its own unhurried pace, while Emily sat across from Judge Cole's clerk and answered question after question about a conversation she wished more than anything had never needed to become a legal matter at all. "You understand," the clerk said near the end of it, "that once this is formally filed, Nathan Vance will be summoned to answer the charges. This won't stay quiet. Word will spread through the territory, not just Cedar Falls." "I understand," Emily said, "and you're certain you want to proceed. Sometimes these things are better settled quietly between families. There's nothing quiet about a man threatening 23 children's education to coerce a woman into marriage." Emily said, her voice sharp with a fury that had been building for days. "I want it in front of a judge. I want it on the record. I want Nathan Vance to answer formally and publicly for what he did." The clerk studied her for a moment, then nodded and resumed writing. "Judge Cole will summon Vance for hearing in 1 week's time, pending your witness's testimony arriving in time. I'll note the complaints filed as of today's date." It was done. Whatever came next, Nathan's fury, his father's influence, the town's judgment, the truth was now a matter of formal record, and no amount of gossip or threat could erase that. Emily walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light, feeling for the first time in days something like solid ground beneath her feet. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took her to see the telegram waiting for her at the boarding house where she'd taken a room. Boom. The telegram was from Elias Whitcomb, sent that very morning, and its message was short enough to read in a single breath and devastating enough to steal every ounce of air from her lungs. "Board voted this morning. Stop. Emergency session called by Vance. Stop. Temporary suspension pending. Review of your conduct. Stop. Return. Cedar Falls. Immediately stop." Emily read it 3 times before the words fully registered, and when they did, the ground she'd felt beneath her feet only minutes before dropped away entirely. They'd voted already. Without her present to defend herself, without waiting for the formal proceedings she'd just initiated, without giving her the chance Ruth was supposed to be buying her. They'd voted, and they'd suspended her, and everything she'd built in 7 years of teaching. Cedar Falls's children hung now by the thinnest of threads. She found Ruth's return message waiting as well, sent later that same day, and this one was worse. Vance moved faster than expected. "Stop," told Board. "You fled town with Mercer to avoid consequences. Stop. Half town believes it. Stop. Come back now. Emily. This is bad." Emily sat down hard on the edge of the boarding house bed, the telegram trembling in her hand, and felt something that had been holding steady inside her since the storm, since the church, since the bowl of stew, since the moment Jack Mercer had said her name like it mattered, begin finally to crack. Nathan hadn't just lied. He'd twisted the truth into something monstrous, painting her formal legal complaint as flight, painting her fight for justice as evidence of guilt. And he'd done it fast enough and cleverly enough that half the town had believed him before she'd even had the chance to explain. She needed to get back to Cedar Falls, immediately. But Jack was somewhere on the road to Osgood's days away, and Ruth was already there fighting a battle that was rapidly slipping out of her control, and Emily was alone in a strange town with a suspension notice in her hand, and a formal fraud complaint that suddenly felt like it might not matter at all if she lost her position before the hearing ever convened. She made a decision in that moment, reckless perhaps, but she was done being reactive, done letting Nathan Vance's lies outpace her own truth. She would ride back to Cedar Falls alone tonight, and she would stand in front of that school board herself and make them listen. The ride back was harder than the ride out had been. No Jack beside her. No Ruth's steady chatter to fill the silence, just Emily and her horse, and the darkening road, her mind cycling relentlessly through everything Nathan might say next. Every lie he might construct, every way this could still fall apart, despite everything she and Jack had risked to set it right. She made Cedar Falls by the following evening, exhausted and travel-worn, and rode straight for the church, where she'd been told the board was reconvening for a final decision. She arrived to find the churchyard full, not just the board, but half the town, drawn by the particular gravity that scandal exerted on small communities, and standing at the center of it, addressing the crowd with the easy practiced confidence of a man who believed he'd already won, was Nathan Vance. "And I say this with genuine sorrow," Nathan was saying as Emily dismounted, her legs unsteady from 2 days of hard riding, "because I once held Miss Carter in the highest regard. But a woman who flees town rather than answer for her conduct, who chooses the company of a grief-mad widower over the reputation this community has always trusted her to protect." "I did not flee," Emily said, her voice cutting across the churchyard, carrying further than she'd intended, in the sudden hush that fell. Every head turned. Nathan's composure flickered just slightly at her unexpected arrival. "Miss Carter," he said, recovering quickly, his smile sliding back into place. "How fortunate. We were just discussing your situation." "You were lying about my situation," Emily said, walking forward until she stood before the assembled board and the watching town, her chin high, despite the exhaustion dragging at every part of her. "I did not flee Cedar Falls to avoid consequences. I rode to the territorial seat to file a formal fraud complaint against you, Mr. Vance, for threatening this school's continued operation with a false claim about your father's land note, a claim the territorial land clerk has already confirmed in writing was untrue." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Whitcomb's eyebrows rose sharply. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Carter," he said. "It's a documented one," Emily said. "Osgood at the land office confirmed the note has no acceleration provision, that our payments are current, and that Mr. Vance's claim about consequences for rejecting his courtship had no basis in the actual terms of the debt. He threatened 23 children's education with a lie, gentlemen, to punish me for choosing not to marry him." "She has no proof of that," Nathan cut in, his voice sharpening. "Wild accusations from a woman desperate to salvage her reputation." "I have a formal complaint filed with Judge Harmon Cole's court set for hearing in less than a week," Emily said. "I have a land clerk's sworn statement en route as we speak, and I have every intention of this community hearing the truth before it decides my fate based on lies you've been spreading since the moment I refused your proposal." The churchyard had gone utterly silent, the crowd's attention swinging like a pendulum between the two of them, and Emily could see in the faces around her the particular vertigo of a town realizing it had been told a story that might not be true. "This is absurd," Nathan said, but something in his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I've done nothing but try to protect this community's standards. You threatened a schoolhouse to punish a rejected marriage proposal." Jack Mercer's voice rang out, and Emily's heart leapt as she turned to see him riding into the churchyard, dust-covered, and clearly having pushed his horse hard, with a second rider close behind, an older man she recognized immediately as Osgood the land clerk himself, saddlebags heavy with what could only be his official records. Jack swung down from his horse, and the crowd parted instinctively as he crossed to stand beside Emily, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Made it faster than expected," he said quietly for her ears alone. "Osgood agreed to ride out himself once I explained the situation. Wanted to see justice done proper, he said." "You found him?" Emily breathed relief flooding through her exhausted body. "You actually found him and convinced him to come." "Told you I'd see this through," Jack said, and then louder, addressing the assembled town. "Mr. Osgood here has traveled 2 days to tell you himself what he already confirmed for Miss Carter. Seems only right you hear it from him directly, instead of taking Nathan Vance's word over hers." Osgood, still catching his breath from the hard ride, nodded and stepped forward. "It's exactly as Miss Carter says. I examined the note myself. There's no provision anywhere in that document for acceleration outside of default, and the school board's payments have been current for the entire 3 years I've held the file. Whatever Mr. Vance told Miss Carter about consequences, it wasn't grounded in any legal reality." He fixed Nathan with a hard look. "In my professional opinion, that's fraud, plain and simple, used to coerce a woman into marriage she didn't want." The crowd's murmur swelled into something louder, angrier, and Emily watched the tide of public opinion, which had turned so viciously against her only a day before, begin visibly to turn again. Nathan's face had gone white, then red, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. "This is a conspiracy," he snarled. "Mercer's been trying to steal her from me since the storm, and now he's bought off some land clerk to lie for him." "I ain't bought nobody," Jack said, his voice low and "Man don't need to buy the truth, Vance. It stands up fine on its own, which is more than I can say for whatever you've been building." "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Nathan spat, and for a moment something raw and unguarded flashed across his face. Not the easy confidence he usually wore, but something closer to desperation. "This isn't about her. This was never just about her." He caught himself visibly biting off whatever he'd been about to say, but it was too late. The words had escaped, and Emily felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What do you mean this was never just about me?" she asked. "Nathan, what are you talking about?" For a moment, Nathan said nothing, his jaw working, his eyes darting toward the crowd, like a man realizing he'd revealed far more than he intended. "Nothing," he said finally too quickly. "I misspoke." But Whitcomb was watching him now with a different expression, entirely suspicion, sharp and sudden, replacing the earlier uncertainty. "Nathan, what did you mean by that?" "I said nothing," Nathan repeated, backing toward his horse. "This whole matter is beneath me. Miss Carter's complaint can proceed however she likes. I have better things to occupy my time than defending myself against the schemes of a desperate schoolteacher and her—" His lip curled with contempt, her grieving widower. He mounted quickly and rode out of the churchyard without another word, leaving behind a silence thick with unanswered questions and a town's worth of suspicion that had shifted decisively in an entirely new direction. Emily stood in the churchyard's fading light, Jack's steady presence beside her, Osgood's sworn testimony hanging in the air, and felt for the first time in days something like solid victory. But Nathan's slip. This was never just about her. Sat cold and unresolved in her chest, a thread she couldn't yet see the shape of, but one that told her with absolute certainty that whatever they'd uncovered so far was only the surface of something considerably larger. The board reversed her suspension that same evening, unanimously, and Whitcomb personally apologized for acting in haste against Nathan's unfounded claims. But even as relief settled over her, even as the town's mood shifted visibly in her favor, over the following days, Emily couldn't shake the unease of Nathan's unfinished sentence. "He said it wasn't just about me," she told Jack 3 evenings later as they sat together on the schoolhouse steps in the cooling summer dusk. What could that possibly mean? What else would his family gain from forcing me into marriage? Jack's brow furrowed, and Emily could see him turning the puzzle over with the same careful attention he'd once given to reading silences. "You said the notes on the land your school sits on," he said slowly. "What if that ain't just about controlling you through the debt? What if the land itself is worth something to the Vances beyond the interest payments? What would a schoolhouse plot be worth to a cattle family?" "Don't know," Jack admitted. "But a man doesn't threaten fraud, doesn't risk his family's whole reputation on a lie over something small. Whatever Nathan let slip, Emily, I don't think it's finished. I think we only just scratched the surface of whatever he's protecting." Emily felt the cold unease settle deeper into her chest, and beside her Jack reached over and took her hand steady and warm, despite the uncertainty ahead. "Whatever it is," he said, "we'll find it, same as we found the truth about the note." "Together," Emily said. "Together," Jack agreed, and in the gathering dark with the fight against Nathan, one but something larger and more dangerous only just beginning to reveal itself, that single word felt like the truest promise either of them had made yet. The answer came sooner than either of them expected, and it came from a source neither had anticipated. Osgood, before riding back to the territorial seat, had left Emily with a piece of advice she hadn't fully understood until 3 days after Nathan's public unraveling in the churchyard. "If I were you, Miss Carter," he'd said, tightening his saddlebags, "I'd pull every deed touching that parcel, not just the note on your schoolhouse. A man doesn't panic over a simple debt. Panics like that usually mean there's something bigger sitting underneath." Emily hadn't understood him then. She understood him now, standing in the county recorder's small back office in Cedar Falls, a converted storage room that the town shared with the land office on alternating weeks, with a stack of survey documents spread across the table and a feeling of dread building steadily in her chest. "Jack." Her voice came out strange tight. "Jack, come look at this." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and Emily pointed to a survey map dated 18 months earlier. The ink faded but still legible, showing the schoolhouse parcel and the land immediately surrounding it. Land Emily had always assumed was simply unclaimed prairie. "This survey," she said. "It's not the original boundary. Somebody redrew the school parcel's lines 18 months ago, shrunk it. And look here." Her finger traced along the margin. "The land that got cut off the piece that used to belong to the school's original grant. It's been folded into a new claim, filed under Cornelius Vance's name." Jack went very still. "How much land are we talking?" According to the original grant, the schoolhouse sat on 40 acres set aside by the territorial government for community education when Cedar Falls was founded. Emily's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against the table to steady them. "This new survey shows the school retaining 6 acres. The other 34 got quietly folded into Vance land." Jack finished, his voice hard. "That ain't a clerical error, Emily. That's theft dressed up in a surveyor's signature. But why would anyone want 34 acres of scrubland behind a schoolhouse? It's not grazing land. It's not near water." The door to the records office creaked open, and both of them turned sharply. Emily instinctively gathering the documents against her chest, as though Nathan Vance himself might be standing there. Instead, it was the town's aging recorder, Silas Broom, a stooped man with spectacles thick as bottle glass, peering at them with obvious surprise. "Didn't expect anyone back here this late," he said. "Miss Carter, Mr. Mercer, something I can help with." "Mr. Broom?" Emily said carefully. "Who filed this revised survey 18 months ago? The one that redrew the school parcel's boundaries?" Broom shuffled closer, squinting at the document over the rim of his spectacles, and something in his weathered face shifted recognition, followed quickly by unease. "That'd be Everett Colby," he said. "Territorial surveyor, works this whole county. Though—" He hesitated. "Though what?" Jack pressed. "Though I recall there was some talk at the time." Broom admitted reluctantly. "Colby came through, redid a handful of surveys in the space of a week, said the original territorial maps had errors that needed correcting. Nobody questioned it much. He's the certified surveyor after all. Man's word is generally taken as gospel on these matters." "Was he paid for this particular correction?" Emily asked, "by anyone beyond his standard territorial wage?" Broom's discomfort deepened visibly. "I wouldn't know about that, Miss Carter. That's not the sort of thing that crosses a recorder's desk." But something in the way he said it told Emily he suspected exactly what she was suspecting, and simply lacked the courage to say it aloud. "Mr. Broom," Jack said, his voice gentler now, coaxing rather than demanding, "we ain't looking to make trouble for you. We're looking to understand why 34 acres of scrubland got quietly moved from a schoolhouse's grant onto Cornelius Vance's ledger, and why nobody in this town noticed for a year and a half." Broom looked between them for a long moment, and then, with the particular relief of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long, alone, he spoke. "There's talk," he said quietly, "among the old-timers who remember the founding grants. Talk that the original territorial survey, the real one filed with the federal land office before Cedar Falls even had a name, showed something on that scrubland. Something worth considerably more than grazing." Emily's breath caught. "What kind of something?" "Copper," Broom said. "Or so the old talk goes. A vein running under that whole stretch behind your schoolhouse, discovered by the original surveying party but never developed on account of the land being set aside for the school before anybody could stake a mining claim on it." The room went silent except for the sound of Emily's own heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. "Copper," she repeated. "There's a copper vein under my schoolhouse's land." "If the old talk's true," Broom said, "I always figured it was just talk myself. Old-timer stories, the kind that grow taller with every telling." But Jack was already looking at the redrawn survey with new eyes, tracing the boundary lines that had been so carefully, so precisely shifted to carve exactly the mineral-rich portion away from the school and onto Vance land. "Story or not," he said grimly, "somebody believed it enough to falsify a federal survey and threaten a woman into marriage to keep her from asking." They rode to Jack's cabin that night, both of them too shaken to trust the walls of town with what they'd discovered, and spread the documents across his kitchen table by lamplight, while Jack fed the stove and tried to organize the fury building in his chest into something useful. "If there's copper under that land," Emily said, staring at the survey until the lines blurred, "and Cornelius Vance knew about it and paid a territorial surveyor to falsify federal records to steal it from a schoolhouse grant." "That's not embarrassment he's protecting," Jack said. "That's a felony. Fraud against a federal land grant, falsification of survey documents, man could hang for less depending on the judge. Which means Nathan wasn't just protecting his father's reputation when he threatened me," Emily said slowly, the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity. "He was protecting a crime that could destroy his entire family if it ever came to light. Threatening my school's funding wasn't really about punishing my rejection at all. It was about controlling me, keeping me close enough to watch close enough that if I ever started asking questions about that land, he'd know before I got anywhere dangerous. And when that failed," Jack said, "when you rejected him outright and went to the land office anyway." "He panicked," Emily finished. "The lie about the note wasn't really about Nathan's pride. It was about keeping me too afraid and too busy fighting for my job to ever look closely at what was actually happening to my school's land." They sat with that realization for a long moment, the weight of it settling heavy in the small cabin. And then Jack spoke again, his voice low and dangerous in a way Emily hadn't heard from him before. Not the quiet grief of the man in the third pew, but something fiercer, protective, in an entirely different register. "We can't take this to Judge Cole alongside the fraud complaint," he said. "Not without more proof than an old recorder's rumor and a redrawn survey line. Cornelius Vance has territorial connections. If we accuse him of falsifying federal land grants without ironclad evidence, he'll bury the complaint and bury us along with it." "Then we need proof," Emily said. "Real proof. Something that shows copper actually exists on that land, and something that shows Colby was paid to falsify the survey." "Colby's the key," Jack said. "If he took a bribe to redraw that boundary, he'll have taken payment somehow. Money don't move invisible, not even when men try hard to hide it. Bank records, land office payments, something." "He works the whole county," Emily said. "He could be anywhere between here and the territorial seat." "Then I'll find him," Jack said, "wherever he is." Emily reached across the table and caught his hand before he could rise, and something in her grip, fierce, urgent, unwilling to let him vanish into danger alone, made him go still. "Not alone," she said. "Whatever this is, whatever Nathan's willing to do to protect it, I'm not sending you into it by yourself. I've already lost people to circumstances I couldn't control. I won't lose you to one I could have prevented by simply staying beside you." Something in Jack's chest cracked open at those words, the careful walls he'd built over 2 years of grief walls that had already been weakening since the storm, since the schoolhouse roof, since every moment Emily Carter had chosen to stand beside him instead of pitying him from a careful distance. "Emily," he said her name rough in his throat. "I already told you once. I ain't real good with pretty words. But I need you to hear this plain, whatever's coming, whatever Nathan and his father are willing to do to protect this. I'd rather face every bit of it standing next to you than safe and alone anywhere else on this earth." The lamplight flickered between them, and for a moment the danger and the copper and the falsified surveys all fell away, and there was only the two of them. And the truth, they'd been circling since a storm trapped them together in a church 3 long years in the making. Jack kissed her then finally, after weeks of careful restraint, after 2 years of believing he'd forgotten how to want anything at all, and Emily met him with a certainty that erased every doubt either of them had carried into that small cabin kitchen. It didn't last long. Nothing gentle in Cedar Falls seemed permitted to last long that summer. A sharp knock at the cabin door broke the moment apart, and both of them startled back, hearts hammering for entirely different reasons now, as Jack crossed to the door with his hand instinctively dropping toward the rifle propped beside the frame. It was Ruth, breathless and pale, her horse lathered from a hard ride. "Emily." Her voice cracked with urgency. "You need to come now. Somebody set fire to the schoolhouse." They rode into Cedar Falls to find the eastern wall of the schoolhouse, scorched black smoke still curling from the wreckage of the woodpile Jack himself had rebuilt weeks earlier. And a cluster of townsfolk gathered in the dark with lanterns and buckets the fire mercifully contained before it could consume the whole structure. "Started around midnight," Whitcomb said, meeting them as they dismounted, his face grim in the lantern light. "Somebody smelled smoke, raised the alarm before it spread past the woodpile and the east wall. Buildings damaged but standing. Could have been considerably worse." "Anybody see who did it?" Jack demanded. "Nobody's saying if they did," Whitcomb admitted. "But Emily—" He hesitated, glancing toward the scorched wall with obvious discomfort. "There's something you should see. Left where nobody could miss it." He led them to the schoolhouse's front door, where a single word had been scrawled in charcoal across the wood, crude and unmistakable in its threat: "Stop." Emily stared at it, feeling the fear she'd carried since Nathan's first veiled threat crystallize into something far more immediate and dangerous. This wasn't gossip anymore, wasn't boardroom politics or careful legal maneuvering. This was a direct physical warning, and it meant someone knew or suspected exactly what she and Jack had discovered in that back records room. "They know we found the survey," she whispered. "Or they're guessing we're close," Jack said, his jaw tight with fury. "Either way, they've moved past lies and threats into arson. That's a man or men who feel cornered enough to risk everything." Ruth, standing beside them, wrapped an arm protectively around Emily's shoulders. "Emily, maybe it's time to step back. Let Judge Cole's court handle the fraud complaint you've already filed, and let this, whatever this new thing is, go to the proper authorities instead of chasing it yourselves. Somebody just tried to burn down your schoolhouse. What's next if you keep pushing?" "If I step back now," Emily said, her voice shaking but resolute, "Nathan and his father win. They burn my schoolhouse, scare me into silence, and keep stealing copper from underneath a children's education grant without a single consequence. I won't do that, Ruth. I can't." "She's not stepping back," Jack said quietly, "and neither am I. But we ain't foolish enough to keep chasing this without protection either." He turned to Whitcomb. "This town's got a marshal, don't it, territorial appointed?" Marshal Boone, Whitcomb said. "Rides through every few weeks, checks on things. Not stationed here permanent, but he's due through within the week, far as I know." "Then we wait for him," Jack said. "Report the arson, report our suspicions about the survey fraud, get territorial law involved properly, instead of chasing Colby down alone and giving Vance more cause to burn something worse than a woodpile next time." Emily nodded, though the frustration of enforced patience sat heavy in her chest. Every day they waited was another day Nathan Vance had to cover his tracks to intimidate witnesses to bury whatever evidence still existed of Colby's falsified survey. But arson was a different animal than gossip, and even Emily's fierce determination understood the wisdom of not walking blindly into whatever came next. Marshal Boone arrived 4 days later, a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the unhurried watchfulness of someone who'd spent decades reading danger in small towns before it fully announced itself. He listened to their account of the arson, the redrawn survey, Nathan's slip of the tongue in the churchyard, with the careful attention of a man who'd heard plenty of stories and had learned to separate truth from exaggeration by instinct. "Copper vein," he said, finally chewing the words over. "That's a serious claim, Miss Carter. Federal land fraud, falsified surveys that ain't something I can act on without solid proof. Old recorders' rumors and a shifted boundary line might get a judge curious, but it won't get you a conviction." "We know," Jack said. "That's why we need to find Colby. If he took payment to falsify that survey, there'll be a record of it somewhere, bank deposits, land office fees, something that shows money moved that shouldn't have." "And if he didn't keep sloppy records?" Boone asked. "Man falsifying federal documents for a bribe usually takes some care covering his tracks." "Then we find another way," Emily said. "We have core samples taken from the land itself prove there's actually copper there worth stealing. If the mineral claim exists independent of Colby's testimony, it strengthens everything else. Boone studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his weathered face. "You've thought this through considerable, Miss Carter." "I've had considerable motivation," Emily said. "Someone tried to burn down my schoolhouse." "Fair point." Boone turned to Jack. "I'll ride out, see if I can be myself. Ask some careful questions before Vance's people know I'm looking. In the meantime," his eyes hardened, "somebody ought to keep watch on that schoolhouse. Whoever set that fire might try again, especially if they realize you're still digging instead of backing off scared." "I'll watch it," Jack said immediately. "Every night till this is settled." "That's a generous offer, Mr. Mercer, but it also paints a target on your back plain as day," Boone said. "Man alone standing guard on a schoolhouse at night, that's an easy thing for somebody desperate to eliminate quiet, if they're inclined toward that kind of desperation." "Then I'll have help," Jack said, and something in his tone made clear he wasn't asking permission. "This town's got more decent folk in it than Vance's money can buy. I intend to find them." He found them faster than even he expected. Word had spread through Cedar Falls about the arson, about the crude threat scrawled across the schoolhouse door, and beneath the fear that spread with it ran a current of genuine outrage, because whatever else the town's residents believed about Emily Carter's conduct with Jack Mercer, nearly every family in Cedar Falls had a child who sat in those schoolhouse desks, and an attack on the school was an attack on something the whole community held sacred. Elias Whitcomb himself volunteered for the first watch along with 2 other board members who'd initially been swayed by Nathan's lies, and now in the wake of the arson, felt the particular guilt of men who'd nearly abandoned an innocent woman to a liar's schemes. "Least I can do," Whitcomb said gruffly, settling onto an overturned crate near the schoolhouse's scorched east wall with a shotgun across his knees. "After doubting you the way I did Miss Carter. Man ought to make amends when he's been fool enough to need making them." Even Delfino Strander, who'd first brought Emily the news of Nathan's slander, showed up on the 3rd night with a basket of food for whoever stood watch, muttering something about decent folk looking out for decent folk, before hurrying off before anyone could thank her properly. Cedar Falls, it seemed, was slowly imperfectly choosing its side. Nathan Vance noticed with mounting fury. He confronted Jack on the 4th night, appearing out of the darkness at the schoolhouse's edge with 2 men Emily didn't recognize flanking him, hired hands judging by their hard, unfamiliar faces, men who worked for wages rather than loyalty. "This has gone far enough, Mercer," Nathan said, his earlier polish stripped away, entirely replaced by something raw and dangerous. "You and that woman have been digging where you've got no business digging. I'm giving you one chance to walk away from this. Take her ride out of Cedar Falls, start fresh somewhere the Vance name doesn't reach. That's more mercy than either of you deserve." "That a threat, Vance?" Jack's hand rested easy near his hip, close enough to his revolver that the message was unmistakable, though his voice stayed level. "'Cause it's starting to sound like a confession instead." "It's an offer," Nathan snapped. "One I won't extend twice." "We ain't interested," Jack said. "Not in your offer, not in your threats, and not in whatever you and your father are so desperate to bury under that schoolhouse land. Territorial marshals already involved Vance. Whatever happens next, it ain't happening quiet, and it ain't happening the way you want it to." Something flickered across Nathan's face, the mask of confidence cracking further, revealing the desperation underneath. "You don't understand what you're threatening," he said, low and urgent. "This isn't just my father's reputation. There are men involved with far less patience than mine, men who've invested considerable money believing that claim would be theirs clean and quiet. You think a school teacher and a grieving widower digging around is just going to inconvenience my family? You're putting yourselves in the path of people who don't ask twice before removing obstacles." The threat landed heavier than anything Nathan had said before, and Jack felt a cold, sharpening focus settle over him. Not fear exactly, but a fierce and total clarity about exactly what was now at stake. "Then those men," Jack said quietly, "ought to have thought twice before stealing from a children's schoolhouse. Get off this property, Vance, before I stop being patient myself. Nathan held his gaze for a long, tense moment, and then with visible effort mastered himself, straightened his coat, and retreated into the darkness with his 2 hired men trailing behind. But his words echoed in Jack's mind long after he'd gone. Men with far less patience than mine. This wasn't just Nathan's scheme, or even Cornelius Vance's alone. Someone else, someone with money, someone willing to burn a schoolhouse and threaten violence to protect an investment, stood behind this entire conspiracy, and Jack understood with sudden and terrible clarity that they had only just begun to uncover how deep this actually ran. Boone returned 6 days later with news that changed everything. "Found Colby," he said, meeting Jack and Emily at the schoolhouse in the gray light of early morning, his face grim with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd ridden hard and learned something he wished he hadn't. Or what's left of finding him anyway. Emily's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Colby's dead," Boone said flatly. "Found 3 days back out past the territorial line. Local sheriffs calling it a robbery gone wrong found him shot, his belongings scattered like somebody'd torn through looking for something specific." The color drained from Emily's face. "They killed him because we were getting close." "Can't prove that," Boone said. "Not yet. But the timing's ugly enough. I don't believe in coincidence anymore, not on this matter." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Found this in Colby's effects before the local sheriff cleared the scene. Sheriff's an old friend let me look through what wasn't already claimed as evidence. It's a bank receipt. Deposit of $400 made 18 months back, same week he redrew your schoolhouse survey." Jack took the paper, scanning it with growing fury. $400 is more than a surveyor makes in a year of honest work. "Considerably more," Boone agreed. "And the depositing bank's out of the territorial capital, not local. I sent a wire asking after the account holder who authorized that deposit. Answer came back same day." He met Emily's eyes, grave and steady. "Accounts held by a mining consortium, Miss Carter. Not just Cornelius Vance personal. A company, Ridgeline Mineral Holdings, with considerable capital behind it, and considerably more reach than one rancher's family." The revelation landed like a physical blow. This wasn't simply Nathan Vance's petty scheme to steal land and force a marriage. This was an organized conspiracy, backed by real money, real power, willing to falsify federal records and murder a surveyor to protect an investment worth. Emily could hardly comprehend. The number, potentially tens of thousands of dollars, in copper, or stolen from a schoolhouse grant meant to educate Cedar Falls children. "This is bigger than we understood," she whispered. "Considerably," Boone agreed. "Which means it's also more dangerous than either of you should be handling without proper protection. I'm sending word to the territorial governor's office myself requesting additional marshals. This ain't a local matter no more. Not with a murdered surveyor and a mining consortium's money tangled up in it." But even as Boone spoke, urging caution, urging patience, urging them to wait for territorial reinforcements, Emily felt something harden inside her chest. Not fear, though. Fear was certainly present, but a fierce and unshakable resolve that had been building since the moment she first saw that redrawn survey line. "Whatever's coming," she said, looking at Jack, finding in his steady eyes the same resolve reflected back at her. "We're not backing down now. Colby died because someone believed silence was worth killing for. I won't let his death mean nothing by walking away from the truth he died protecting." Jack reached for her hand, and this time in front of Boone and Whitcomb and the scorched remains of the schoolhouse wall, he didn't hesitate to hold it. "Together," he said, echoing the promise they'd made days before, though now it carried the weight of considerably higher stakes. "Together," Emily confirmed. Behind them, unseen in the pale morning light, a figure watched from the tree line at the edge of town. Not Nathan Vance this time, but someone else entirely. Someone whose presence in Cedar Falls neither Jack nor Emily yet knew to fear. Dispatched by interests far larger and far more ruthless than one desperate rancher's son protecting his family's secret. The real danger Emily and Jack were about to discover had only just arrived in Cedar Falls. The man in the tree line called himself Cyrus Doan, though that name, like everything else about him, was carefully constructed to reveal nothing true. He'd arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days earlier, took a room at the boarding house under the pretense of scouting grazing land for an Eastern investment group, and spent his evenings listening to the mercantile gossip to the church, whispers to every scrap of talk about a schoolteacher, a widower cowboy, and a fraud complaint that had somehow, despite Cornelius Vance's considerable efforts, refused to stay buried. He watched Jack and Emily from the tree line that, with the patient assessing stillness of a man for whom violence was simply another tool, no more remarkable than a hammer or a ledger book. And when they finally rode back toward town, he turned his own horse and rode in the opposite direction, toward a modest cabin 2 miles outside Cedar Falls, where Cornelius Vance himself was waiting. "They know about the consortium," Doan said without preamble, dismounting in the yard. "Marshals traced the payment to Colby back to Ridgeline. It's only a matter of time before they trace Ridgeline back to you." Cornelius Vance was a broad, heavy man in his 60s, with none of his son's polish, and considerably more of his cruelty, worn plain on his weathered face. He set down the coffee cup he'd been holding, with a hand that trembled not from fear, Doan understood, but from the particular fury of a man watching decades of careful accumulation threaten to collapse. "My son was supposed to handle this quietly," Cornelius said. "Marry the girl, keep her occupied and grateful, let the whole matter fade before anyone thought to look twice at that survey." "Your son," Doan said flatly, "threatened a schoolhouse full of children and got a fraud complaint filed against your family for his trouble. Then he tried burning the evidence, which only made the town rally behind her instead of against her. Your son, Mr. Vance, has been a considerable liability." Cornelius's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue the point. "What do you propose instead?" "The consortium didn't send me to negotiate," Doan said. "I was sent to protect the investment. $40,000 committed against that copper vein contingent on clean title. If Miss Carter and Mr. Mercer produce proof of the falsified survey before we secure that title through other means, every man who invested in Ridgeline stands to lose everything, and you along with them, given your names attached to the whole arrangement. Then handle it." Cornelius said something desperate creeping into his voice, despite its gruffness. "Whatever needs handling." Doan studied him for a long moment, and something cold and final settled behind his eyes. "Understand what you're asking, Mr. Vance. I don't scare people into silence. That's your son's amateur approach, and it's failed twice already. If I handle this, I handle it permanently." Cornelius Vance said nothing for a long moment, staring into his cooling coffee, and then, with the particular moral flexibility of a man who'd spent his whole life justifying whatever served his interests, he nodded once. "Handle it," he said again, quieter this time, as though volume alone might absolve him of what the words actually meant. Jack felt it before he could name it, a wrongness in the air of Cedar Falls that hadn't been present even in the darkest days of Nathan's threats and the schoolhouse fire. He'd spent enough years reading danger in silence, first in the war his own father had fought and told him about in fragments, then in 2 years of grief that had taught him to notice every shift in a room's temperature, and something about the past few days sat wrong in his chest like a held breath waiting to break. "You've gone quiet again," Emily said, watching him from across the schoolhouse desk where they'd taken to reviewing their evidence each evening after her students went home. "Not your usual quiet. Something's troubling you." "Man's been asking questions about you around town," Jack said. "Delphine mentioned it yesterday. Stranger staying at the boarding house calling himself a land scout, but asking considerable more questions about our fraud complaint than any grazing survey would need. You think Nathan's father hired someone?" "I think," Jack said carefully, "that whoever's behind that mining consortium didn't invest $40,000 in stolen copper just to fold quiet the moment a schoolteacher started asking questions. Nathan's been an amateur this whole fight. Threats lies a poorly set fire. Whoever's really running this, they ain't going to make the same mistakes." Emily felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Boone said he was requesting territorial reinforcements. Has there been any word?" "Nothing yet, and that worries me more than silence usually does." Jack rose, crossing to the schoolhouse window, checking the darkening road with the same careful vigilance he'd maintained every night since the fire. "I want you staying at Ruth's tonight, not your own place." "Jack, please." The word came out rougher than he intended, edged with a fear he rarely let show. "I already buried one woman I loved, Emily. I ain't fixing to lose another to somebody's greed over a copper vein. Humor me on this." Something in his voice, the raw, unguarded fear beneath the request, made Emily's protests die in her throat. She crossed to him, took his hand, and felt the tension coiled through his whole body, like a man bracing for a blow he couldn't yet see coming. "All right," she said softly. "Ruth's tonight. But Jack, you can't carry this alone either. Whatever's coming, we face it together, same as we promised." "I know," he said. "Don't mean I have to like it." The blow, when it came, arrived not for Emily, but for Jack, and it came with a cruelty calculated precisely to break the one thing that had kept him standing through 2 years of grief and 3 months of fighting for a woman he'd only just allowed himself to love again. He found the note nailed to his cabin door. 2 mornings later, the paper weathered like it had been prepared in advance, waiting for the right moment to deliver its particular devastation. "Mercer, you lost one woman already to circumstances beyond your control. Careful how hard you fight for the next one. Some debts get collected regardless of what a man wants. There was no signature, no need for one." Jack stood in his own yard, reading those words with a cold fury, building in his chest, that felt for the first time since Sarah's death almost impossible to contain. He rode for the schoolhouse immediately, and found Emily mid-lesson 23 children's faces, turning curiously toward the door, as he burst in disheveled and grim, in a way that made Emily's stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "Class dismissed early today," Emily said quickly, reading the danger in his face. And within minutes, the children had scattered toward home, leaving the two of them alone in the sudden ringing silence of the empty schoolroom. "What happened?" Emily said, already crossing to him. Jack handed her the note without a word, and she read it twice before the full weight of its threat settled into her chest. "They're threatening to kill me," she whispered. "They're threatening both of us." Jack set his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "And I'll be damned if I sit quiet and wait to see which threat they follow through on first." "We need Boone," Emily said. "Now today, not waiting on territorial reinforcements that might not arrive for another week." "Boone rode out 3 days back," Jack said. "Following a lead on Ridgeline's territorial connections. Ain't due back till tomorrow at the earliest." He raked a hand through his hair, and Emily watched him fight visibly against every instinct that told him to bundle her onto a horse and ride as far from Cedar Falls as the land would allow. "I want you at Ruth's doors locked, and I want Whitcomb or one of the other men standing watch till Boone's back. And you? What are you going to be doing while I'm hiding at Ruth's?" "Making sure whoever left that note understands threatening you comes with considerable more cost than they're prepared to pay," Jack said, and something in his voice, quiet, lethal, absolutely certain, made Emily's breath catch. "Jack, if you go looking for whoever left this note, you're doing exactly what they want. Drawing you out, isolating you." "I know that," Jack said. "Don't mean I can sit still while they threaten to bury you same as they buried Colby." Emily grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her, fully forcing the fury in his eyes to focus just for a moment on her, instead of on the vengeance building in his chest. "Jack Mercer, look at me. I did not survive my mother's death, and I did not fight through Nathan's lies, and I am not about to lose you to your own grief-driven recklessness now. If you go charging after whoever left this note alone, you become exactly as vulnerable as they want you to be. We wait for Boone. We report this properly. We do not become the very thing this town already fears, grief-mad and reckless, exactly like Nathan accused you of being." The words landed harder than she intended, but they landed true, and Jack felt the fury in his chest slowly, reluctantly give way to something more controlled, more strategic. "All right," he said finally. "We wait for Boone. But Emily—" His hand came up to cradle her face, the same gentle gesture from weeks before, now weighted with considerably more desperation. You don't leave my sight till this is settled. Not for a moment. I mean that. I won't, Emily promised. They didn't yet know how quickly that promise would be tested. Boone returned that evening a full day earlier than expected, his horse lathered and his face grim with news that arrived like a second blow atop the first. Ridgeline Mineral Holdings, he said, meeting them at Ruth's boarding house where Emily had reluctantly agreed to stay under Whitcomb's watchful guard, traces back through 3 shell arrangements to a consortium out of the territorial capital. Cornelius Vance holds that stake, but he ain't the majority holder. Man who controls the largest share. Boone pulled a folded telegram from his coat, his expression darkening further. Goes by the name Josiah Reeves. Made his fortune in mining claims up in the Northern Territories, and word is he's got a reputation for making problems disappear when they threaten his investments. Disappear how? Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Permanently, Boone said flatly. 2 separate claim disputes in the past 5 years, both involving witnesses who intended to testify against Reeves's mining interests. Both witnesses died before they could give testimony. Nothing ever proven, mind you. Reeves's careful works through hired men who leave no trail back to him directly. But the pattern's ugly enough that territorial authorities have suspected him for years without ever building a case that would stick. Jack's hand found Emily's gripping tight. That's who's behind Colby's murder. Behind the note nailed to my door. Likely, Boone said. I've sent word to the territorial governor requesting a full martial detachment given the scope of what we're now looking at. But that'll take time to arrive, best case 4 days. Worst case closer to a week. A week, Emily repeated. You're telling us to survive a week against a man who's already killed once to protect this investment. I'm telling you to be careful and stay close to people you trust till help arrives, Boone said. I'll do what I can in the meantime, but I'm one Marshal, Miss Carter, against a consortium with considerable money and at least one hired man already proven willing to kill. The room fell into heavy silence, the weight of their situation settling over all of them, until Ruth, who had been listening from the doorway with growing alarm, spoke up with an idea that in its simplicity cut through the mounting despair. What if you don't wait for them to come to you? She said. What if you get ahead of it? Publish what you know, the survey, the Copper Colby's murder, the consortium, get it into as many hands as possible, as fast as possible. A man like Reeves, his whole strategy depends on staying hidden, on eliminating threats. Quiet before anybody else learns the truth. But if the truth's already out, already known by half the territory killing you, 2 doesn't solve his problem anymore. It just confirms everything you've already said. Jack turned to her, something sharpening in his expression. You're saying make ourselves less valuable dead than alive. I'm saying take away his reason to kill you, Ruth said. If Emily and Jack die mysteriously right after publicly accusing a mining consortium of fraud and murder, that's not going to look like coincidence to anybody. Least of all a territorial governor, already primed to be suspicious of Reeves's history. Reeves is careful, you said so yourself, Marshal. Careful men don't take reckless risks once the calculation stops favoring them. Boone considered this for a long moment, and slowly, reluctantly nodded. It's a gamble, but it might be the safer gamble given what we're facing. There's a territorial newspaper out of the capital. The Frontier Herald reaches most of the major settlements within a week of publication. If we get a full account to them backed by the evidence you've already gathered, it puts Reeves's whole operation in a position where killing you creates more danger for him than letting you live. Then that's what we do, Emily said, her voice steadying with sudden purpose. We write it all down, the survey, the note from Osgood Colby's death, the payment record, everything Boone's uncovered about Reeves. We get it to that newspaper before Reeves can stop us. That's a 2-day ride to the capital, Jack said. Same road Colby died on. Then we don't take the road alone, Boone said. I'll escort you myself and I'll deputize 2 more men from town for the ride. Whitcomb's already proven he'll stand and fight for what's right. We move fast, we move careful, and we get this story into print before Reeves even realizes what we're planning. They rode out before dawn 2 days later. Jack, Emily, Boone, Whitcomb, and a quiet, capable rancher named Tobias Kern, who'd volunteered without hesitation, once he heard the full account of Nathan's fraud and Colby's murder, moving fast along a route Boone had chosen specifically to avoid the main road, where Colby had likely met his end. The tension of the ride sat heavy over all of them, every unfamiliar sound in the brush. Drawing hands toward holsters, every distant rider glimpsed on the horizon, triggering a held breath until they confirmed it was simply another traveler unconnected to the danger stalking them. "You're doing that thing again," Emily said quietly, riding beside Jack as the miles stretched behind them, "where you go silent and watchful, like you're expecting an ambush from every direction at once. Man who's already seen what desperate people are capable of tends to stay watchful," Jack said. "Ain't going to apologize for wanting you alive at the end of this ride." "I'm not asking you to apologize," Emily said. "I'm asking you to trust that we're going to survive this. That we're going to walk into that newspaper office, tell the truth, and walk back out again with your hand in mine and this whole nightmare finally behind us." Jack looked at her, something raw and vulnerable crossing his weathered face. "I want to believe that, Emily. I do. But I already believed once that the woman I loved was going to be fine, that fever was just fever, and 11 days was enough time to fix whatever was wrong. I was wrong then. Grief's taught me not to trust, believing things will be fine no matter how much I want them to be. This isn't fever, Jack. This is a fight we can win if we're smart and careful and don't lose our nerve." Emily reached across the distance between their horses and took his hand, holding tight despite the awkward angle. "I need you to believe it, though. Not for my sake alone, but for yours. You've spent 2 years letting grief convince you that wanting anything is too dangerous to risk. I won't let this fight take that belief and hope away from you again." Jack's fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment, riding through open country with danger somewhere behind them and uncertain safety somewhere ahead, something in his chest that had stayed clenched since Sarah's death loosened just slightly in the face of Emily's fierce and unwavering certainty. They made camp that evening in a defensible hollow. Boone selected with a soldier's practiced eye, and it was there, as the others settled for a tense and watchful night, that Whitcomb Gruff, uncomfortable Whitcomb, who'd nearly voted to suspend Emily on Nathan's lies weeks before, approached Jack with something clearly weighing on him. "Wanted to say?" Whitcomb began awkward in a way that didn't suit his usual blunt confidence. "I'm sorry for doubting Miss Carter, for nearly costing her everything on account of Nathan Vance's lies. Man ought to know better than to believe the loudest voice in the room instead of the truest one." "Ain't my forgiveness to give," Jack said. "That's between you and her. I know, already said as much to her back when the board reversed the suspension." Whitcomb hesitated, then continued. "But I wanted you to know something else too. This ride we're on, this fight against Reeves and his consortium, half this town's watching how it turns out, Jack. Watching whether standing up against powerful men actually means something, or whether money and threats always win in the end. You and Emily, you're not just fighting for yourselves anymore. You're fighting for every family in Cedar Falls that's ever felt small against somebody bigger and richer." The weight of that settled heavy on Jack's shoulders, but underneath the weight, something steadying too, a sense that whatever came next, they weren't fighting alone, weren't isolated, the way he'd spent 2 years believing he deserved to be. "Then we'd best not lose," Jack said quietly. "No," Whitcomb agreed. "We'd best not." They reached the territorial capital by the following evening, exhausted and travel-worn, but intact, and found the offices of the Frontier Herald tucked between a bank and a saloon, its windows still lit, despite the late hour. The editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Cordelia Vance Ashford, no relation to Cornelius Vance, though the shared surname drew an uneasy look from Emily. Upon introduction, listened to their full account with growing intensity, her pen moving rapidly across a notepad, as Jack and Emily laid out every piece of evidence they'd gathered. Falsified federal survey, murdered surveyor, a mining consortium, backed by a man with a documented pattern of eliminating witnesses, Cordelia said when they'd finally finished. "This is considerable, Miss Carter. Considerable enough that I'll want to verify what I can before we run it. The Herald doesn't print accusations we can't substantiate, not against men with Reeves's resources and reputation for retaliation against anyone who crosses him." "We understand," Emily said. But time isn't a luxury we have. Whoever's working for Reeves already tried burning my schoolhouse, already left threats nailed to Jack's door. Every day this stays unpublished is another day we're vulnerable." Cordelia studied them both for a long moment, something calculating behind her sharp eyes. "I can verify the land office records myself. I have contacts there who'll confirm the survey discrepancy within a day. Osgood's testimony, if he'll provide it in writing, strengthens things further. And Marshall," she turned to Boone, "if you're willing to put your name and badge behind the account of Colby's murder and the bank records tracing back to Ridgeline, that goes a considerable way toward making this bulletproof against any libel claim Reeves's lawyers might threaten." "I'll put my name to every word of it," Boone said. "Already have." "Then give me 2 days," Cordelia said. 2 days to verify what needs verifying, and I'll run this as the lead story distributed to every settlement this paper reaches. Reeves won't be able to bury this quiet, not once it's in print across the whole territory. 2 days. It felt like an eternity, given everything that had already happened, but Emily understood the necessity of it. A story that couldn't withstand scrutiny would do more harm than good, would hand Reeves's lawyers exactly the ammunition they needed to dismiss the entire account as reckless slander. 2 days, she agreed. They took rooms at a boarding house near the newspaper office. Boone and his deputized men maintaining careful watch through both nights, and it was on the second night, with publication only hours away, that the danger they'd been racing to outpace finally caught up with them. Jack woke first, some instinct honed by 2 years of grief-sharpened watchfulness registering the wrongness, before his conscious mind fully understood why. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside their rooms. Not the ordinary creak of another boarder moving toward the shared washroom, but something more careful, more deliberate, the sound of a man trying and failing to move silently. He rose without wakening Emily in the adjoining room, revolver already in hand, and eased the door open just enough to see a figure tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the unhurried confidence Jack recognized instantly from Cornelius Vance's yard, weeks before, though this man was a stranger to him. Pausing outside Emily's door with something small and metallic catching the low lamplight in his hand. "Touch that door," Jack said quietly, stepping fully into the hallway, revolver leveled. "And it's the last thing you touch, mister." The stranger turned slowly, unhurried, despite the weapon aimed at his chest, and Jack got his first look at Cyrus Doane's face. Cold, calculating utterly, without the panic Jack expected from a man caught in the act of whatever violence he'd intended. "Mercer," Doane said, almost pleasant. "Wondered when you'd wake. Man like you, watchful as they say you are. Who sent you?" It wasn't a question. "You already know who sent me," Doane said. "Same man who'll keep sending others long after you and I are finished here tonight. That's the thing about money, Mercer. It's patient. It doesn't run out of hired hands the way you might run out of luck." "Reeves," Jack said. "Josiah Reeves." Something flickered in Doane's cold expression, not quite surprise, but acknowledgement that they'd traced further than he'd anticipated. "Impressive. Doesn't change the outcome, though. That story you've been chasing publication for, it dies tonight, along with whoever's foolish enough to still be chasing it." Behind Jack, Emily's door opened and she emerged into the hallway with a small pistol of her own gripped in steady hands, her face pale but resolute in the lamplight. "The story already went to print an hour ago," she said. Cordelia moved up publication when Boone warned her the danger might be escalating. "Whatever you're planning tonight, Mr. Doane, it's already too late to stop it." For the first time, something genuine cracked through Doane's careful composure, not quite panic, but a cold recalculation, a man realizing the ground beneath his entire mission had just shifted. "You're lying," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words intended. "Check for yourself." Boone's voice cut in from the end of the hallway where he'd emerged with Whitcomb and Kern flanking him. Weapons drawn, the four of them now surrounding Doane in a hallway that offered him no possible escape. "Frontier Herald ran the story on this morning's edition. Full account falsified survey Colby's murder. Ridgeline's connection to Reeves, everything. Copies are already on stagecoaches heading to every settlement this paper reaches. You kill every one of us standing here tonight, mister. It changes nothing. The truth's already out. Doan's eyes moved across the hallway, calculating odds that had turned decisively against him. And for a long, tense moment, Jack watched him weigh violence against surrender with the cold detachment of a professional, assessing a failed job, rather than a man facing his own possible death. "Your employer's investment," Boone continued, his voice hard and certain, "is finished, mister. Whether you finish us tonight or not. Only question left is whether you're going to hang alongside Reeves for Colby's murder, or whether you're going to put that knife down and maybe talk your way toward leniency by telling us exactly what Reeves ordered and when." The calculation in Doan's eyes shifted, hardened, and then, with the particular pragmatism of a man whose loyalty had always been purely transactional, he let the knife clatter to the floorboards. "Reeves ordered Colby's death personally," he said, his voice flat, resigned. "Said the man was getting nervous talking too much about the survey to anybody who'd listen. Wanted him silenced before he could testify to anybody official." His eyes flicked to Emily, and something almost like respect flickered across his cold features. "Was supposed to handle you two the same way quiet made to look like misfortune. Reeves doesn't like loose ends, and you two have been considerable loose ends. You're confessing to conspiracy in a murder," Boone said, already moving to secure Doan's wrists. "And attempted murder given tonight's intentions. That's enough to build a case against Reeves himself if you're willing to testify formal in front of a judge." "I testify," Doan said. "I need protection. Reeves doesn't forgive betrayal any gentler than he forgives failure." "Territorial protection can be arranged," Boone said, "provided your testimony's thorough and truthful." As Boone led Doan away into custody, Emily finally let the pistol in her hands lower her whole body, beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, and Jack crossed the hallway to gather her against his chest. Both of them trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and the enormity of what they'd just survived. "We did it," Emily whispered against his shoulder. "The story's published. Doan's confessing. This might actually be over." "Might be," Jack said, though something in his voice carried caution rather than full relief. "Reeves is still out there, Emily. Man with that kind of money and that kind of reach, he ain't gonna simply accept defeat because one hired man got caught confessing." "Then we finish this properly," Emily said, pulling back to meet his eyes with fierce determination despite her trembling hands. "We get Doan's testimony formalized, get warrants issued for Reeves and Cornelius Vance, both, and we make certain this ends in a courtroom instead of another shadow in a hallway." Jack looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd faced down a hired killer with steady hands and unwavering resolve, who'd fought through lies and fire and threats without once considering retreat, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized with startling clarity as absolute certainty. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't rightly know how to say everything I'm feeling right now, but I know I don't want to face whatever's still coming without you standing exactly where you're standing right now beside me for the rest of whatever life we've got left to live." Emily's breath caught, understanding exactly what he wasn't quite saying outright, and despite the exhaustion and danger of the night behind them, something warm and hopeful bloomed in her chest. "Then don't," she said simply. "Don't face any of it without me. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever again." They didn't speak further of what that promise meant. Not yet, not with Doan's confession still needing to be formalized, and Reeves's reckoning still ahead of them. But the words hung between them, certain and unshakable, as the boarding house finally settled back into an uneasy quiet around them. Outside, somewhere beyond the territorial capital's dark streets, the first copies of the Frontier Herald were already reaching towns and settlements across the region, carrying with them the truth about a falsified survey, a murdered surveyor, and a mining consortium's ruthless conspiracy. A truth that Josiah Reeves, wherever he currently sat counting his stolen fortune, had no possible way left to bury. His reckoning had already begun, whether he knew it yet or not. Josiah Reeves learned of the Frontier Herald's publication over breakfast in the territorial capital's finest hotel. And by the time he'd finished reading the full account of his own conspiracy, laid bare across the front page, his coffee had gone cold, and his careful, decades-long habit of remaining invisible had been shattered beyond any repair he could purchase. "Get me Cornelius Vance," he said to the man standing at his elbow, his voice betraying none of the fury coiling beneath his composed exterior. "And find out what happened to Doan. He should have handled this 2 nights ago." "Marshal's office has Doan in custody, sir," the man reported, having already gathered what intelligence he could. "Word is he's talking. Full confession naming you directly in Colby's murder." Reeves set down the newspaper with deliberate care, though his hand trembled slightly with the effort of controlling his reaction. For years he'd built his fortune on careful invisibility on hired men, who never traced back to him on witnesses who conveniently disappeared before they could testify against his interests. 40 years and one schoolteacher with a stubborn conscience had unraveled it in the space of a summer. "Then we're finished waiting for subtlety," Reeves said finally. "Ready my horse, and send word to whoever's still loyal among my men. I want Mercer and the Carter woman found before territorial marshals can build a case solid enough to hang me. This ends now, one way or another." Boone received the telegram from the territorial governor's office 2 days after the Herald's publication, and the words on the page brought the first genuine relief Emily had felt since discovering that redrawn survey line weeks before. "Governor's dispatching a full detachment," Boone said, reading the telegram aloud to Jack and Emily in the marshal's temporary office at the Capitol. 6 marshals authorized to pursue and arrest Reeves and Cornelius Vance, both formal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Doan's confession, combined with the bank records and Osgood's testimony, gave the governor more than enough cause to act decisive. "Then it's over," Emily said, though something in her voice carried more hope than certainty. "Reeves and Vance ain't been arrested yet," Jack said carefully. "Ain't over till they're actually in custody, Emily. Man with Reeves's resources, he's had 2 days now to prepare for exactly this outcome. Could be anywhere by the time marshals reach wherever he's been operating from." Boone nodded grimly. "Mercer's right to be cautious. I've got word Reeves was staying here in the Capitol when the story broke. Hotel register confirms it, but he checked out within hours of the paper's publication. Nobody's seen him since." "And Nathan?" Emily asked. "Cornelius Vance's son. Has anyone confirmed where he stands in all this?" "That's the other piece of news," Boone said, his expression shifting into something more complicated. "Nathan Vance turned himself into the Cedar Falls Town Council yesterday morning. Says he wants to cooperate, fully testify against his father and Reeves, both in exchange for leniency on his own charges." Jack's jaw tightened. Man threatened to burn down a schoolhouse and coerce a woman into marriage. Now he wants leniency for turning on his own father the moment things got dangerous. "Man's scared," Boone said. "And scared men sometimes make honest choices for dishonest reasons. Doesn't make his testimony less valuable, whatever his motivations. If Nathan corroborates what Doan's already confessed, that's another nail sealed tight in Cornelius Vance's coffin." Emily considered this for a long moment, remembering Nathan's cruel confidence in the churchyard, his casual willingness to threaten children's education to force her hand, and found she felt less anger toward his sudden cooperation than she expected. Mostly, she realized, because she was simply exhausted from carrying anger this long, and grateful for anything that moved them closer to safety. If his testimony helps convict the men actually responsible for Colby's murder, she said finally, then let him testify. Justice doesn't require my forgiveness to function properly. It only requires the truth. They rode back toward Cedar Falls the following morning, the marshal's detachment fanning out separately to search for Reeves across the territory, while Boone escorted Jack and Emily home alongside Whitcomb and Kern, all of them maintaining careful vigilance despite the growing sense that the worst danger had finally passed. It was 3 miles outside Cedar Falls, in a narrow stretch of trail, cutting through dense pine, that the danger proved it hadn't passed at all. The first shot came without warning, splintering bark from a tree just beside Jack's head. And within seconds, the peaceful morning ride had exploded into chaos. Boone shouting orders, horses rearing in panic. Kern already returning fire toward a ridge above the trail, where gun smoke betrayed at least 2 shooters positioned with clear tactical advantage. "Emily down!" Jack's voice cracked with raw urgency as he swung himself from his horse, pulling her down with him into whatever cover the trail's shallow ditch could offer his body, instinctively curving over hers as another shot cracked through the air above them. "How many?" Emily gasped, her heart hammering, as Jack drew his revolver, positioning himself between her and the ridge with fierce protective focus. "2, maybe 3, Boone called from his own position, returning fire methodically. "Positioned high, which means they had time to prepare this. This ain't chance, this is planned." "Reeves," Jack said grimly. "Has to be. Man's making one last try before the marshals can close in." Another volley of shots rained down, and Whitcomb cried out, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him, blood already soaking through his shirt sleeve. "I'm all right," he gritted out, though his face had gone pale with pain. "Keep firing. Don't worry about me." Jack's mind raced through their limited options, pinned in a shallow ditch, outnumbered in position, if not in skill. Emily's safety weighing heavier on him than his own survival ever could. "Boone, can you get a clean shot at that ridge?" "Not from here," Boone called back. "Angle's wrong. Need to flank them, but that means somebody's got to move exposed across open ground first." "I'll go," Jack said immediately. "Jack, no." Emily's hand caught his arm with desperate strength. "Emily?" He turned to her, and despite the chaos and danger, his voice carried absolute steadiness. "I ain't losing you today. Not after everything we survived to get here. I need you staying low, staying safe, and trusting that I'm coming back." "You said you wouldn't face this without me," Emily said, tears cutting through the dust on her face. "You promised." "And I meant it," Jack said. "But right now the way I keep that promise is making sure you survive long enough for me to keep it properly for the rest of our lives, instead of just today." He pressed a hard, fierce kiss to her forehead. "Trust me." Before she could argue further, Jack broke from cover, sprinting low across open ground toward a stand of boulders that would give him flanking position on the ridge, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels as the shooters above adjusted their aim toward this new moving target. Emily watched with her heart in her throat, Boone and Kern providing covering fire as best they could, until Jack disappeared behind the boulders and the shooting from the ridge shifted suddenly toward wherever he'd vanished. The next several minutes stretched into an eternity of gunfire and screaming silence between shots, until finally, mercifully, the shooting from the ridge stopped, entirely replaced by an unnatural quiet that felt somehow more terrifying than the chaos before it. "Jack!" Emily's voice came out cracked, desperate. "Jack!" For one horrifying moment there was no answer at all. Then, from the ridge above, Jack's voice called down, rough but unmistakably alive. "Clear, got both of them, one's down, permanent, others wounded and surrendering." The relief that flooded through Emily was so overwhelming, her legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she scrambled up from the ditch, ignoring Boone's cautious warning, to wait, running toward the boulders, where Jack was already making his way down a streak of blood, visible along his temple, where a bullet had grazed dangerously close. "You're hurt," she gasped, reaching him, her hands moving frantically over his face, his shoulders checking for wounds beyond the obvious graze. "Just a scratch," Jack said, though his voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man who'd just faced death and survived it through nothing but skill and sheer stubborn will. "Emily, I need you to breathe. I'm all right. We're all right." Emily didn't answer with words. She simply pulled him into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both off balance. And Jack held her back with equal desperation, both of them shaking in the aftermath of violence that had come far too close to ending everything they'd only just begun building together. "The wounded man," Boone called, approaching with the surviving shooter now bound and stumbling under Kern's watchful guard. "Says his name's Pharaoh, hired by Reeves, personally paid to ambush this exact stretch of trail today. Says Reeves is holed up at an old mining camp about 6 miles north, waiting to hear whether this ambush succeeded before deciding his next move. Then we don't give him the luxury of deciding anything else," Jack said, his voice hardening despite the fresh graze along his temple. "Boone, you get Whitcomb back to Cedar Falls for proper doctoring. Get word to the Marshal Detachment about that mining camp's location. Reeves needs to answer for this today before he has the chance to run further." "You're wounded yourself," Emily said. You should come back to town. Let someone tend that graze properly. It's shallow, Jack said. Barely bled. I ain't letting Reeves get another chance to hurt you while I'm off nursing a scratch, Emily. This ends today. Something in his voice, fierce, protective, absolutely resolute, told Emily that arguing further would be pointless. And despite her fear for his safety, she recognized in that moment the same fierce determination that had carried them both through every danger since the storm first trapped them together in that church. Then I'm coming with you, she said. Emily, I already told you once, Jack Mercer, whatever's coming, we face it together. That promise cuts both directions. Her chin lifted steady, despite everything they'd just survived. I'm not staying safely behind while you ride toward Reeves alone. Not today, not ever. Jack studied her for a long moment, torn between his fierce need to protect her and his growing understanding, built slowly over months of watching her fight through every obstacle Nathan and Cornelius, and now Reeves, had thrown at her, that Emily Carter had never once needed protecting from her own choices, only support in making them. All right, he said finally. Together then. The mining camp sat abandoned, save for the small cluster of tents Reeves and his remaining men had erected near the mouth of an old played-out shaft, and by the time Jack and Emily arrived alongside Boone's hastily gathered posse, Kern, 2 deputized ranch hands, and eventually the territorial marshal detachment that arrived within the hour drawn by Boone's urgent messenger, Reeves had already realized, with the particular clarity of a cornered man, that his options had narrowed to almost nothing. Reeves, Boone's voice carried across the camp, hard and commanding. Territorial Marshal's fully authorized detachment. You're under arrest for the murder of Everett Colby, conspiracy to commit fraud against a federal land grant, and attempted murder of Jack Mercer and Emily Carter. Come out with your hands raised, and this ends peaceable. For a long, tense moment, nothing moved in the camp, and Jack positioned himself instinctively in front of Emily, despite her earlier insistence on facing this together, some protective instinct too deeply ingrained to override even now. Then slowly, Josiah Reeves emerged from the largest tent. His hands raised, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away, replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who understood finally and completely that his 40 years of careful invisibility had run out. $40,000, he said almost to himself as marshals moved to secure his wrists. $40,000 of investment unraveled by a school teacher and a widower cowboy who couldn't simply mind their own business. Wasn't our business to mind? Emily said, stepping forward despite Jack's instinctive hand on her arm. You stole land meant for children's education, murdered a man for threatening to expose it, and tried twice to kill us both for uncovering the truth. That's not a matter anybody with a conscience could simply look away from, Mr. Reeves. Reeves studied her for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering behind his cold, calculating eyes. You're a stubborn woman, Miss Carter. Under different circumstances, I might have admired that quality. Under different circumstances, Emily said, you might have chosen honest investment over fraud and murder. We don't always get to choose which version of ourselves we become, Mr. Reeves. But we do choose what we do with the choices already made. You chose poorly every single time it mattered. As the marshals led Reeves away toward custody, Jack finally allowed himself to exhale fully for what felt like the first time in weeks, the accumulated tension of every threat, every fire, every gunshot finally beginning to release from his shoulders. It's over, he said, almost disbelieving. Emily, it's actually over. Almost, Emily said, though relief was already flooding through her own exhausted body. Cornelius Vance is still out there somewhere. She wouldn't have to wait long for that particular resolution either. Word reached Cedar Falls 2 days later that Cornelius Vance had been apprehended attempting to flee toward the Northern Territory border. His flight itself serving as damning confirmation of guilt that Doan's confession and Nathan's cooperative testimony had already established beyond reasonable doubt. He would stand trial alongside Reeves before Judge Harmon Cole's circuit court, the full weight of federal land fraud and conspiracy to murder charges awaiting both men. Nathan, whose cooperation had proven instrumental in building the case against his father and Reeves, both received considerably lighter charges: coercion and attempted fraud related to his threats against Emily's school, and would face his own reckoning before the same court, though considerably less severe than what awaited the men who'd orchestrated murder to protect their stolen fortune. Cedar Falls, meanwhile, began the slow work of healing from a summer that had tested the town's character in ways nobody could have anticipated, when Jack Mercer first sat silent in his third pew, watching Emily Carter play hymns from 4 rows away. The schoolhouse reopened within the week, its scorched east wall repaired with lumber donated by half the town's families, and Emily returned to her 23 students with a fierce gratitude for the ordinary rhythm of teaching that she'd feared during the darkest days of threat and violence she might never experience again. Miss Carter. One of her younger students, a girl named Prudence, with solemn eyes and a habit of asking questions well beyond her years, lingered after class one afternoon, while the others filed out toward home. "Is it true you found copper under the school? Papa says that's why the bad men tried to hurt you?" Emily knelt to meet the girl's eyes properly. "It's true there was copper found on land that belonged to this school, Prudence. And it's true some very greedy men tried to steal it and tried to hurt people who discovered what they'd done. But you stopped them," Prudence said with the absolute certainty children sometimes possess about matters adults understood as considerably more complicated. "You and Mr. Mercer. You stopped the bad men." "We did," Emily said, "with a lot of help from a lot of brave people in this town." "Are you going to marry him?" Prudence asked with the particular bluntness that made Emily nearly choke on her own breath. "Mr. Mercer, I mean. Mama says everybody's wondering." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. "That's a question for Mr. Mercer and myself to work out privately, Prudence." "I hope you do," Prudence said, matter-of-factly gathering her books. "He looks a lot less sad now than he used to. Mama says that's on account of you." She skipped out the door before Emily could formulate any response, leaving Emily standing alone in her schoolroom, with her heart considerably fuller than it had been in longer than she cared to calculate. The territorial trial convened 3 weeks later, and Emily and Jack rode together to the Capitol to testify, their combined account corroborated by Boone's investigation, Osgood's documentation, Doane's full confession, and eventually Nathan's own testimony, building a case so thoroughly airtight that Judge Cole's ruling, when it finally came, surprised no one who'd followed the proceedings. Josiah Reeves was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang for Colby's murder, with the fraud and conspiracy charges rendered moot beside the gravity of that ultimate judgment. Cornelius Vance, whose direct involvement in the murder itself remained less clearly established despite his obvious complicity in the broader fraud, received a lengthy prison sentence and the forfeiture of every asset connected to the falsified survey, meaning the 34 acres of copper-rich land, along with a substantial civil penalty, would revert to the schoolhouse grant it had been stolen from in the first place. Nathan received 2 years imprisonment for his coercion and attempted fraud, a sentence Judge Cole tempered specifically in light of his cooperation, though the judge made clear in his ruling that cooperation earned mercy, not innocence. "You made choices that harmed an innocent woman and threatened children's education," Judge Cole told Nathan directly before pronouncing sentence. "That your father and his associates proved considerably more monstrous doesn't erase your own guilt. I hope, Mr. Vance, that you use whatever time you serve to become a man considerably different from the one who stood in that churchyard threatening a schoolteacher's livelihood." Nathan, stripped of every ounce of his earlier arrogant confidence, simply nodded his eyes, finding Emily's across the courtroom with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Miss Carter," he said, before the marshals led him away, "I am sorry. For all of it. Whatever that's worth to you now." Emily studied him for a long moment and found somewhat to her own surprise that she believed him. "I hope you become someone worth that apology, Nathan," she said. "That's what it's worth." Chamsham. The land reverted formally to the school's grant within a month, and with it came something Emily hadn't fully anticipated, a substantial settlement, ordered by the court, from the forfeited assets of Ridgeline Mineral Holdings, intended to compensate the school for the fraud committed against its original grant. $14,000. Whitcomb said, reading the settlement figure aloud to the assembled school board with evident astonishment. That's Miss Carter. That's enough to build an entirely new schoolhouse. A proper one with separate rooms for different ages, real desks, instead of the makeshift ones we've patched together for years. And, added Purdy, who had grown considerably more supportive of Emily since watching her survive an ambush and testify with unwavering composure against a mining consortium. Enough left over to properly compensate you for a salary that's been frankly embarrassingly modest for 7 years of excellent service. Emily sat in silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had emerged from the wreckage of that terrible summer. Not just survival, not just justice, served against the men who'd threatened everything she cared about, but genuine tangible restoration for the community she'd fought so hard to protect. I'd like the new schoolhouse built on the original footprint, she said finally once she'd found her voice again. But larger. And I'd like a portion of the settlement set aside specifically for scholarship funds for any Cedar Falls family who can't otherwise afford books or supplies for their children. That's generous, Miss Carter, Whitcomb said, considering everything you personally endured to secure this settlement. It's not generosity, Emily said. It's simply remembering why any of this mattered in the first place. 23 children's education threatened by greedy men who valued copper more than the futures of families they'd never bothered to know. Seems only right the settlement serves those same children as fully as possible. The board approved her proposal unanimously, and within weeks construction began on a new schoolhouse, larger, sturdier, built with the particular care of a community that had nearly lost something precious, and now understood with hard-won clarity exactly how much that precious thing was worth protecting. It was on a warm evening in late summer, nearly 4 months after Jack Mercer first sat silent in his third pew, watching Emily Carter play hymns she'd long since memorized, that he finally found the words he'd been carrying since a storm first trapped them together and changed everything that followed. He'd asked her to meet him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the churchyard, the same tree Emily realized as she approached, beneath which the whole congregation had gathered for a memorial service years earlier, before she'd truly known Jack Mercer at all, before he'd become the center of everything her heart had quietly, persistently wanted, despite 3 years of careful denial. You picked a strange spot for whatever this is, Emily said, finding him waiting with visible nervousness written across his weathered face, a nervousness that struck her as almost endearing, given everything they'd survived together. Gunfights and fraud and murder trials. And yet here he stood, hands fidgeting with his hat like a man facing considerably greater danger than any hired killer had posed. Ain't strange, Jack said. This tree's where half this town's important moments happened one way or another. Weddings, funerals, baptisms. Figured it was fitting for what I got to say. Emily's heart began beating faster, understanding with sudden clarity exactly what moment they were approaching. Jack, let me get through this, he said, before I lose my nerve entirely. I ain't much good with speeches, you know that better than anybody. She fell silent, watching him gather himself. Watching the man who'd sat wordless in his pew for 2 years find finally the words he'd apparently been building toward since that storm first trapped them together. 3 years I watched you from that pew, Jack said, and told myself I didn't deserve to want anything again, not after Sarah. Told myself silence was safer than risking loving somebody and losing them all over again. Then a storm trapped us together, and you handed me a bowl of stew, like it was nothing at all, and something in me that I thought was buried for good started waking back up, despite every effort I made to keep it sleeping. Jack, I ain't finished, he said, though his voice had gone rough with emotion. Since then, Emily, you've fought fraud and fire and men who wanted us both dead, and through every single bit of it, you never once flinched, never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am. Silent when I'm silent, stubborn when I'm stubborn, slow to speak, but meaning every word once I finally do. He knelt then, pulling something small from his coat pocket. A ring simple and unadorned, clearly handmade with the same careful attention he'd once given to carving wooden horses for stranded children during a storm. I ain't got much to offer beyond a cabin, some land, and a heart that took considerable convincing to open back up. But everything I got, Emily Carter, I want to give to you. If you'll have me. Emily felt tears building despite her every effort at composure watching this man who'd once been nothing but silence and grief in a lonely third pew kneel before her with his whole broken healing heart laid bare. "You were never late, Jack," she said, echoing words she'd carried in her chest for months without quite finding the right moment to say them. "I was just always waiting for you to finally look at me." "Is that a yes?" Jack asked, hope breaking through his nervousness like sunlight through storm clouds. "That's an absolutely unconditionally yes," Emily said, and Jack rose to slip the ring onto her trembling finger before pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything 2 years of silence and 3 years of careful watching had finally fully released. They married beneath that same oak tree. 3 weeks later, Cedar Falls's entire congregation gathering to witness a union that felt to everyone present like the natural conclusion to a summer that had tested and ultimately strengthened the whole community's understanding of courage, justice, and the particular grace of second chances. Ruth Callahan served as Emily's witness, dabbing at happy tears throughout the entire ceremony, despite her earlier teasing about the whole affair, while Whitcomb and half the school board stood proudly among the gathered well-wishers, their earlier doubts about Emily's conduct long since replaced by fierce protective pride in the woman who'd fought so hard for their children's future. Pastor Whitfield, presiding over the ceremony with visible emotion of his own, spoke of resilience and redemption of a town that had faced genuine darkness and emerged ultimately stronger and more united for having survived it together. "Jack Mercer," he said, addressing the groom directly, "2 years ago, you sat in that third pew like a man who'd forgotten how to hope for anything beyond simple survival. Today you stand here transformed, not because grief disappeared entirely. For grief never fully disappears, but because you found the courage to let love back into a heart you believed had closed permanently. That courage, more than any fortune or fraud or copper vein, is the true treasure this summer revealed." Jack, standing beside Emily with his hand steady in hers, despite the emotion visible in his weathered face, found himself for once entirely comfortable with the attention of an entire congregation watching him speak his vows. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong across the churchyard. "I spent 2 years believing silence was the only language left to me. You taught me different. You taught me that love ain't about having pretty words ready at every moment. It's about choosing every single day to keep showing up, keep fighting, keep believing in something worth building, even when the whole world's trying to burn it down. I choose you, Emily, today and every day after, for as long as I got breath left to keep choosing." Emily. Her own voice, thick with emotion, met his vow with equal certainty. "Jack Mercer, I watched you from 4 rows away for 3 years, learning the shape of your silence, before I ever learned the sound of your voice. I know now that some of the strongest love stories aren't built on grand declarations, but on quiet, steady presence, on a man who fixes a roof without being asked, who rides toward danger to protect what matters, who finds his voice again. Not because grief disappeared, but because love proved stronger than the fear that grief left behind. I choose you too, Jack, completely and for the rest of my life." Pastor Whitfield pronounced them husband and wife to the sound of the entire congregation's joyful applause, and when Jack finally kissed his bride beneath that old oak tree, Cedar Falls witnessed the culmination of a love story that had begun in silence and ended triumphantly in a declaration heard clearly across the whole churchyard. The new schoolhouse opened its doors the following spring, its bright, spacious rooms filled with considerably more children than the old building had ever accommodated, thanks to the scholarship fund that ensured no family in Cedar Falls need choose between education and economic hardship ever again. A small plaque near the entrance, funded by the settlement and installed at the school board's unanimous insistence, read simply, "In memory of Everett Colby, who died protecting the truth." Jack and Emily settled into married life on Jack's land, expanding the small cabin into a proper home over the following months. And on Sundays, the whole congregation of Cedar Falls witnessed something that would have seemed impossible only a year before. Jack Mercer, seated in the third pew, as always, but no longer silent. his voice joining the hymns with the particular enthusiasm of a man who'd rediscovered fully and permanently every reason he had to sing. Emily still played the organ, still watched the congregation with the same careful attention she'd always given her town. But now, when her eyes drifted to the third pew, she found Jack watching her back openly, without shame or careful restraint, his love for her worn as plainly and proudly as his hat. Ruth Callahan, watching this transformation with the particular satisfaction of a friend who'd waited 3 long years for exactly this outcome, leaned toward Emily one Sunday morning with her familiar knowing smile. "Told you," she whispered, "every single Sunday watching each other. Just needed a storm to finally push you both toward saying so." Emily smiled, her hands finding the opening chord of the morning's first hymn, her heart full with a peace she'd once feared she might never fully know. "Some things," she said, "are worth every bit of the wait." And in Cedar Falls, where a summer of fraud and violence had ultimately given way to justice, healing, and a love story the whole town would tell for generations to come, that peace proved finally and completely unshakable.